Hello and welcome. I know many of you use this video to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. Name of the story: The Roaming Spirits. The mansion stood all alone at the edge of a quiet, forgotten town. Its tall towers and cracked stone walls made it look scary, especially in the dark. The windows were broken, and the front doors hung loose on their hinges. People in the town told stories about the place, saying terrible things had happened there. No one went near it anymore. Some who did were never seen again. A team of paranormal investigators decided to spend a night inside the mansion, hoping to learn the truth about the stories. They were called the Veil Seekers. There were 5 of them, each with different skills: researchers, a medium, and tech experts. They came prepared with cameras, recorders, infrared thermometers, and salt. They knew they might be dealing with more than just a haunted house. They might be facing something far worse. Jonathan Hale, the leader of the group, stood outside the mansion looking up at it. He was tall with neatly combed hair. His expression was serious but determined. "This is it. We go in now," he said, his voice calm but tense. "Are we sure about this?" asked Emily, the historian. She was young, short, and carried a notebook. She wasn't sure she wanted to go inside. The town stories, they sound too real. "We came here to find out the truth," Jonathan replied, walking toward the mansion. "We're not leaving until we do." The others followed, their footsteps crunching on the overgrown path. As they neared the doors, they suddenly creaked open, almost as if the house was inviting them inside. The air inside was thick and musty, full of the smell of old wood and dust. The grand foyer was huge, with cracked marble floors. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the air was heavy with silence. The group turned on their flashlights, cutting through the darkness, but the shadows seemed to move on their own. "Stay close," Jonathan said, his voice firm. "We need to set up our equipment. Emily, start looking for old records. The rest of you, start checking the rooms." Emily hesitated, looking around the dark halls. "Okay, I'll go upstairs. Maybe I can find something there." Jonathan nodded, and the team spread out. The house felt alive, as though it was watching them, listening. Every floorboard seemed to creak with every step they took, and every shadow seemed to twitch, like it was ready to move. They explored the rooms, finding strange symbols carved into the walls, hidden behind layers of old wallpaper. Some were faint and barely noticeable, while others were sharp and clear, almost as if someone had carved them recently. "Check this out," Ben, the tech expert, called from across the room. He was looking at the electrical panel. "These carvings don't look normal. They might be warnings." Jonathan walked over, looking at the symbols. They were strange, and they made the room feel colder. "This house is older than we thought," he muttered. "This isn't just a house. It's a tomb, and we're inside it now." The group kept moving, but the deeper they went, the worse the feeling got. The air grew colder, and their breath became visible. Then they started hearing strange sounds, scratching noises like nails on wood, and soft whispers that seemed to come from all directions at once. "I don't like this," Sarah, the medium, whispered, holding her hands out. She was usually calm, but even she could feel the fear. "I can feel it. Something is here. Something dark. And it's not alone. Do you know what it is?" Emily asked from the doorway of a room she had been searching. "I can feel something. The spirits are angry. And there's something else, something controlling them." Before anyone could say anything, a loud crash came from the other side of the mansion. The sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor followed. "Stay together," Jonathan shouted, rushing toward the noise. The group followed quickly, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. They reached a large dining room. The long table was covered in dust, and chairs were knocked over. The chandelier above them swung back and forth, even though there was no wind. And then they heard it, the dragging sound growing louder. They turned to see an old chest moving across the floor, as if it was being pulled by invisible hands. "What the hell?" Ben whispered, stepping back. His hand moved toward his equipment, but the lights flickered and went out completely. The room was swallowed by darkness. Then they heard it, a low, heavy breathing, coming from somewhere in the room. "It's not ours," Emily gasped. "Shh," Jonathan ordered, holding his hand up. The group stood still, their hearts pounding. The room was silent except for the breathing, which was growing louder and closer. Suddenly, a shape moved in the corner of the room. It was tall and thin, like a person, but twisted and wrong. It stepped forward slowly, its body barely visible in the dark. The figure raised its arm, pointing straight at them. "Run!" Jonathan shouted. But before anyone could move, the door slammed shut with a loud bang, trapping them inside. The door slammed with a deafening crash, the heavy sound reverberating through the room. For a brief moment, all the team members stood frozen, staring at the dark figure in the corner, their breaths shallow and quick. The air was thick with fear, and the strange, heavy breathing still echoed, now joined by a low, almost growling sound, like something hungry waiting in the dark. "Get to the window. Now!" Jonathan barked, snapping the team out of their trance. They rushed toward the nearest window, but it was sealed shut, locked from the inside. They pushed against it with all their strength, but it refused to budge, as though the mansion itself was refusing to let them escape. The room felt smaller with every passing second, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. "What the hell is that thing?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at the shadow. The figure moved again, its long, skeletal limbs twisting in unnatural ways. It stepped forward, its shape clearer now, tall, gaunt, with skin stretched tightly over its bones. Its eyes, though faint, glowed an eerie shade of red, and its mouth was open, revealing rows of jagged, sharp teeth. It looked like something that had been dead for years, but still very much alive, a monster that should have never existed. "We need to move, now," Jonathan shouted again, his heart racing. He turned toward the doorway, but the hallway beyond was dark, and he knew that even if they ran, it might not matter. The mansion was toying with them. "Jonathan!" Sarah, the medium, screamed. "It's coming closer. I can feel it. There's no way out." The figure raised its arm once again, its fingers elongated and reaching, pointing directly at Jonathan. A cold chill washed over him, and his skin prickled as if ice had replaced his blood. It was like the figure had control over everything in this house, like it could see inside their very souls. "There's something wrong with this place," Emily gasped, her voice barely audible. She backed away from the window, her eyes never leaving the creature. "It's like it's pulling us in. No time for doubts." Jonathan snapped, his voice barely holding its ground against the rising panic. He quickly scanned the room. There had to be another way out. As his eyes darted over the space, they landed on the fireplace, its stone hearth cracked and dark with soot. "Over there!" Jonathan pointed to the fireplace. "Move. We're going through." The team rushed toward the fireplace, hoping there might be something behind it. An escape, a hidden passage, anything. They pried at the stones, their hands shaking, when suddenly the room grew colder. Much colder. They could see their breath, forming small clouds in the air. A loud crack echoed through the room. The shadow in the corner of the room moved again, this time closer, its footfalls slow and deliberate. It seemed to glide across the floor, unnaturally silent despite its size. As it drew closer, the sound of its breathing grew louder, now almost unbearable. The scent of decay filled the room, sharp and suffocating. Ben, the tech expert, scrambled to pull out his EVP recorder, hoping to capture something. Anything that might explain what was happening. "We need to get evidence," he muttered, but even as he spoke, the device began to glitch, static buzzing louder, blocking any sound. He cursed under his breath. "That thing, it doesn't want us here," Sarah whispered, her eyes locked on the creature. It's not just angry. It's feeding off our fear. Jonathan turned toward her, his face grim. We have to get out of here. Now. We can't let it control us. Suddenly, a loud crash shook the mansion. The entire room seemed to tremble, and the lights flickered back on, momentarily blinding them. When their eyes adjusted, the figure was gone. But the tension in the room only grew thicker, heavier. Something was watching them, waiting. The crack in the fireplace widened as Jonathan pressed harder, his palms slick with sweat. Finally, a piece of stone gave way, revealing a narrow opening in the wall behind the hearth. A dark tunnel stretched beyond, leading further into the unknown. "Quick, get in," Jonathan ordered, his voice sharp. There was no time to waste. The team scrambled through the opening one by one, Ben and Emily going first, then Jonathan and Sarah, with the door slamming shut behind them just as the creature reappeared at the threshold. The tunnel was narrow and cold, the air stale and damp. It smelled like earth, like something long buried. As they moved through the passage, the walls closed in on them, forcing them to move in single file. The further they went, the darker it became, and the silence grew oppressive. But then, ahead of them, they saw a faint light. It flickered like a candle flame, soft and warm, drawing them toward it. Jonathan's heart raced. They needed to get to that light, to whatever it was. It was their only hope. "There's something up ahead," Emily whispered, her voice shaky but full of determination. "We have to keep going." They pushed on, each of them feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in. As they drew closer to the light, the temperature dropped once more, the cold creeping into their bones. The light grew stronger, more real, but the shadows seemed to stretch out in response, reaching toward them like hands. They reached the source of the light, a small, flickering candle sitting atop a wooden pedestal in the center of a circular room. The walls were lined with old, rotting bookshelves filled with dusty, forgotten texts. This is wrong," Sarah said, stepping back. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with fear. This room shouldn't exist." The moment she spoke, the air grew even colder, and a soft whisper echoed around them, low and mocking. "You should have never come." Before anyone could react, the door to the tunnel slammed shut behind them. They were trapped, and in that moment, the walls seemed to close in, the darkness becoming more alive, pressing closer. And somewhere, deep in the mansion's heart, the sound of footsteps echoed, slow and steady, as if something was coming for them. There was no escape. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. As the door slammed shut behind them, a cold wave of panic washed over the group. They were trapped. There was no way out, no sign of the creature, but they could still feel its presence lurking in the darkness, watching them. Jonathan's mind raced. They needed to find a way out, but the walls seemed to close in on them with every breath. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands trembling as he scanned the room. The candle on the pedestal flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. "What is this place?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "How is this room even here?" Sarah stepped forward, her face pale, her eyes wide. "It's not just a room. It's a prison." Jonathan looked around, trying to make sense of it. The bookshelves were old, filled with dusty volumes, their pages yellowed with age. But the shelves seemed to go on forever, spiraling upward in the center of the room. The ceiling above them was high, dark, and oppressive, making the room feel like it was closing in from all sides. The faint whispering voice echoed once more, this time clearer. "You should have never come." Ben, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "This isn't just a haunted house. It's something else. It's alive, in a way." "I know," Jonathan said, his voice steady but tense. "This place is feeding off us, off our fear. We can't let it control us. We need to find a way out, now." As if on cue, the temperature dropped even further. The candle on the pedestal flickered violently, casting wild, erratic shadows across the room. For a moment, It seemed as though the shadows themselves were stretching toward them, trying to wrap around them like cold, invisible hands. "I feel it," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's getting closer. Something is coming." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. He had no idea what it was, but he could feel it too. A presence, something ancient and malicious, was closing in on them. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the walls seemed to pulse, as if the house itself was alive and breathing. Suddenly, one of the bookshelves near the far wall creaked. The sound was almost imperceptible at first, but then it grew louder, the wood groaning as if something was moving behind it. The shelf began to shift, sliding open slowly, revealing a dark, narrow passageway beyond. "Is that another way out?" Emily asked, her voice full of hope. Jonathan didn't hesitate. "We have no choice. We go now." They rushed toward the opening, but as they moved closer, the air seemed to thicken, like walking through water. Each step felt heavier, as if the mansion itself was trying to pull them back. The passageway beyond the bookshelf was even darker than the room, the air dank and stale. The light from the candle flickered faintly as they entered the narrow corridor, the walls pressing in on either side. The stone floor was uneven, and the sound of their footsteps echoed in the silence. The whispering voice was louder now, close enough that it felt like it was right behind them. "You should have never come." Jonathan's heart raced, but he kept moving forward. He had no choice. "Keep going. Don't look back." They moved down the passage, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. But as they walked, the walls seemed to narrow, the space closing in around them. The temperature dropped even more, and their breath came out in visible puffs of steam. "I don't think we're getting out," Ben said, his voice thick with dread. "This place, it doesn't want us to leave." Just as Jonathan was about to respond, the walls in front of them seemed to shift. The stone moved, grinding against itself with a horrible, bone-chilling sound, and a deep crack appeared in the stone floor ahead. "No!" Emily screamed, stepping back. "It's happening again. It's trying to trap us." The crack widened, and from the darkness below, something began to rise. It was long and twisted, like roots or tendrils reaching out of the earth, grasping, pulling. The walls themselves seemed to ripple, as if the house was alive, as if it had a mind of its own. Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Get back! We can't let it take us." They turned to run, but the passage behind them had already shifted. The walls had closed off, leaving no way to go back. They were trapped. The sound of the growling voice filled the passage, the words almost too faint to understand. "You should have never come." And then, out of the darkness, something grabbed Sarah. Her scream echoed through the hall, but no one could help her. The shadows enveloped her, and in an instant, she was gone, pulled into the darkness, vanishing without a trace. "Sarah!" Jonathan shouted, his heart racing. He tried to reach her, but the shadows swallowed her whole, leaving only silence. The team stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. Sarah was gone, and now they were truly alone in the heart of the mansion. A cold laugh echoed from the walls, a low, mocking sound that sent chills down their spines. "This is only the beginning," the voice hissed, the sound growing louder. "You should have never come." There was no escape now. The mansion had claimed them, and whatever was inside had no intention of letting them go. The walls began to close in again, and the darkness spread like an unstoppable force. The air in the passageway grew colder still, biting into their skin as the darkness deepened. The laughter from the walls, low and cruel, seemed to come from everywhere, echoing through their bones and rattling their minds. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't afford to stop. The others were still with him, though the absence of Sarah was like a void, an ache that weighed down on him. "We need to keep moving," Jonathan said through gritted teeth, trying to keep his voice steady. He didn't want to acknowledge the fear creeping up his spine. If he did, it would be over. "We can't let it trap us." The group moved forward, their footsteps loud in the eerie silence that followed Sarah's disappearance. Every sound seemed amplified, the scraping of their shoes against the cold stone, the quick, shallow breaths as they tried to calm their nerves. Each step felt like they were marching towards something much darker, something that would never let them go. The passageway continued winding deeper into the mansion's bowels, the stone walls slick with moisture. It smelled of decay, like the house had been abandoned for centuries. But even as they moved further, they could feel the house shifting around them, as if it were alive, consciously aware of their presence. Jonathan glanced over his shoulder, checking on Emily, Ben, and Sarah's empty spot. He forced himself not to look back too often. The place was designed to unnerve them, and he wouldn't let it. Not now. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. The floor cracked again, but this time, it wasn't just a small fissure. The entire floor beneath them shuddered, and a loud rumbling sound echoed through the narrow passage. "Run!" Jonathan shouted. He didn't wait to see if the others were following. He ran blindly down the passage, heart racing, urging his legs to move faster as the walls began to close in on him. The space seemed to shrink with every step, the narrow corridor tightening until it felt as though the walls were pushing against them. The cold that had clung to them before now became oppressive, making it hard to breathe. A low growl resonated from deep within the walls, the same deep, guttural noise that had come from the creature moments before. Jonathan could feel his mind starting to unravel. His thoughts became a blur, and the weight of the silence pressed harder on his chest. He couldn't hear the others behind him anymore. The darkness was everywhere, thick, pressing against his skin, like it had weight and form. Then from the corner of his eye he saw it, a figure not far ahead. It was tall and thin, just like the creature. Its twisted limbs stretched unnaturally, moving in jerky, grotesque motions. It was covered in shadows, but its glowing red eyes pierced through the darkness. "No, no!" Jonathan's voice was barely above a whisper, his feet frozen to the spot. It was standing in front of him, blocking the path. The figure tilted its head, staring at him with those glowing eyes, its mouth parting slowly, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "It's here," Jonathan whispered, backing away. The presence of the thing filled the passageway, and Jonathan felt a cold pressure on his chest. He wasn't sure if it was the thing itself or just the house, but it was like a weight was crushing him. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. The figure stepped closer, its long fingers stretching toward him. Jonathan's mind raced. He knew that whatever this thing was, it was the source of everything. The mansion's evil, the disappearance of Sarah, the darkness closing in around them. In the distance, he could hear the others, their hurried footsteps growing louder. He turned to see Emily and Ben just behind him, eyes wide with fear as they approached. The creature didn't seem to notice them yet. It was focused entirely on Jonathan, and that terrified him more than anything. "Run!" he shouted to the others. "Now!" Without hesitation, Emily and Ben turned and sprinted past him. Jonathan didn't follow right away. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the creature, frozen in terror. It stepped forward once again, its mouth twisting into an unnatural smile. The whispering voice came again, louder this time, echoing from the walls. "Join us," it hissed. "You should have never come." The pressure on Jonathan's chest grew, and for a moment, it felt like he couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to press in tighter, the air growing thick and suffocating. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the figure lunged forward, its hand reaching out for Jonathan. But before it could grab him, the passageway suddenly shuddered. A deep rumbling sound echoed through the walls, and the entire room began to twist, shifting and changing. The walls bent inward, but then the passage collapsed with a loud crash, the floor crumbling beneath Jonathan's feet. He stumbled, barely managing to keep his balance, as the house seemed to eat itself alive. The floor gave way, and in an instant, Jonathan was falling. The darkness swallowed him. Jonathan gasped, waking with a jolt, His eyes flew open, and for a moment, he wasn't sure where he was. He lay flat on his back, staring up at a low ceiling. His heart hammered in his chest as he realized he was no longer in the narrow corridor, but lying on the cold stone floor of a new room. He shot up, looking around. The room was vast, with high, vaulted ceilings that stretched far above him. The walls were adorned with decaying tapestries, and the air was thick with dust. A dim light flickered in the far corner, casting strange shadows on the walls. The familiar whispering voice echoed faintly, like a distant memory. "Jonathan, welcome." He scrambled to his feet, his body aching. His pulse raced in his throat. The floor creaked underfoot, and he turned to see Emily and Ben standing at the far end of the room. They looked disoriented, confused, just as terrified as he felt. "Where are we?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Jonathan replied, his eyes scanning the room. "But we're not safe yet." The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, swirling around them, as if the room itself was alive. The whispering came again, growing louder, more insistent. "Join us," the voice hissed, sending chills down their spines. And then, the laughter returned, dark and mocking. The game was far from over. The laughter echoed throughout the room, bouncing off the cold stone walls and shaking the very foundation beneath their feet. The sound was relentless, chilling, and it seemed to grow louder, more distorted with every passing second. Jonathan's skin crawled, his heart hammering in his chest. They were being toyed with, just like the others who had come before them. Emily grabbed Jonathan's arm, her fingers trembling. "What the hell is going on? Where are we?" Jonathan shook his head, struggling to process everything. "I don't know, but we need to find a way out, fast." He looked around, trying to make sense of their surroundings. The room was vast, but it felt oppressive, the shadows stretching too long and the air too still. The light flickering in the corner was their only source of visibility, casting eerie reflections on the floor. Everything felt wrong. Nothing about this room was natural. "We're not alone," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan turned to look at him, and that's when he saw it. In the far corner of the room, standing just beyond the flickering light, a figure had materialized. It was tall and thin, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows. Its face was obscured, but they could feel its eyes on them, burning through the darkness like embers. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching them with an unsettling stillness, as if it was waiting for something to happen. "I knew it," Emily murmured, taking a step back. "We shouldn't have come here." Ben clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "What do we do now?" Jonathan's mind raced. This wasn't just a ghost. This wasn't something they could banish with a simple exorcism or EVP recording. Whatever this was, it was tied to the house, no, to the land itself. He felt it in his bones. They were dealing with something much older, much darker than they could ever understand. "We have to get to the source," Jonathan said finally, his voice steady despite the rising panic. "There has to be something here, some kind of clue. Something that can tell us how to stop this." Ben and Emily nodded, though they looked uncertain. They didn't have much time. The figure in the corner hadn't moved, but the sense of dread in the room was growing stronger, like the air was thickening around them. It was only a matter of time before whatever was controlling this place made its move. Jonathan turned toward the far end of the room, where a large wooden door stood. The door was ancient, covered in dust and cobwebs, but it looked like the only way out. He didn't know where it led, but they couldn't stay in this room any longer. They needed to escape, to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. "Let's go," he urged, pushing forward. The team moved cautiously toward the door, the weight of the silence pressing down on them. But just as Jonathan reached for the handle, the whispering voice came again, now so loud that it felt like it was coming from inside his own mind. "Why are you running?" the voice hissed. "You can never escape. This place is your home now." The door before them creaked as though it had a life of its own. The light from the corner flickered violently, casting strange, shifting shadows across the room. For a moment, Jonathan thought he saw something move, something crawling on the walls just beyond the light. But when he looked again, it was gone. Emily and Ben exchanged nervous glances, but Jonathan didn't hesitate. He turned the handle, the old wood groaning in protest, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was darker, colder. The air felt stale, thick with the scent of rot. The walls were covered in strange, indecipherable symbols, etched into the stone with what looked like blood. The flickering light from the other room barely reached into this new space, and they could hear the distant sound of what could only be described as scratching, like something or someone was trying to escape from within the walls. "Where are we?" Emily whispered, her voice filled with dread. Jonathan stepped inside cautiously, his flashlight casting weak beams of light across the room. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he noticed a large, worn chest in the center of the room. It was old, covered in dust and cobwebs, but there was something about it that drew his attention. It felt important. He moved toward it, and without saying a word, he knelt before it, his hands shaking as he reached for the latch. The moment his fingers brushed the cold metal, a jolt of electricity shot through his body, making him flinch back. "What the hell was that?" Ben gasped, his voice filled with panic. Jonathan steadied his breathing and tried again, this time lifting the latch slowly. The chest creaked as it opened, revealing a pile of old, yellowed papers, a few books bound in cracked leather, and a single ornate mirror. It was small, not much larger than a pocket-sized frame, but its surface was covered in strange, swirling symbols that seemed to move under the dim light. "What is this?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan reached for the mirror, lifting it cautiously out of the chest. As soon as his fingers touched the surface, a cold rush of air hit him, and the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. The walls seemed to close in, the scratching sound growing louder. A low, menacing growl filled the room, but this time, it wasn't coming from any creature. It came from inside the mirror itself. Jonathan's hand trembled as he stared at the reflection in the glass. What he saw wasn't his own face. It wasn't even human. The reflection twisted, distorted, showing a shadowy figure standing just behind him. The figure was enormous, its form too dark and too large to be real. It had multiple limbs, stretched and contorted in ways that defied nature, and its eyes, those glowing, hateful red eyes, locked onto his own. "Join us, forever," the figure whispered, its voice distorted and otherworldly. Jonathan dropped the mirror, stepping back in horror, but it was too late. The darkness surged forward from the reflection, filling the room with a deafening roar. The walls seemed to collapse around them, the air becoming thick and suffocating. And then, in an instant, the world around them went black. Jonathan woke up with a start, gasping for air. He was no longer in the room with the mirror. He was lying on the cold stone floor, the dim light from the hallway flickering faintly in the distance. The silence was deafening, but as he sat up, his heart sank. The others were gone, and the whispers had begun again. "Join us." Jonathan's hands shook violently as he stood up, trying to piece together what had just happened. The room was dark and cold, but something felt different now, a strange emptiness that gnawed at him. The shadows in the hallway flickered wildly, casting eerie reflections along the walls. It was as if the mansion itself was watching him, breathing in his fear. "Where am I?" Jonathan whispered, his voice barely audible over the oppressive silence. Panic gripped him tightly, but there was no time to process it. The fear had seeped too deep into his bones. He had to find the others, if they were still alive. The dim light from the hallway beckoned him forward, casting elongated shadows that twisted and contorted as he moved. Every creak of the old wooden floor beneath him echoed ominously through the narrow corridors. Jonathan wiped his clammy hands across his damp forehead, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "This is impossible," Jonathan murmured, shaking his head as he tried to convince himself it was all just a hallucination, that somehow he had stumbled into a nightmare. But deep down, he knew better. The feeling of dread was far too real. Desperation clawed at his chest. "Emily? Ben? Answer me." His voice cracked, hollow and weak against the silent walls. But there was no reply, only the whispering, louder now, swirling around him like a storm. The voice came from every direction, weaving together from the walls, the shadows, the very air itself. "Why do you resist?" it hissed. "We are waiting, forever." Jonathan felt his knees weaken, the crushing weight of fear pressing down harder than ever. Every shadow seemed alive, growing and shrinking in response to the voice. The walls pulsed like they had a heartbeat, breathing with unnatural life. He staggered forward, gripping the nearest wall for balance, every step dragging him deeper into the darkness. The hallway twisted and turned, winding endlessly like a maze with no end. The house seemed endless, alive, watching him every step of the way. He could feel his mind unraveling, the memories of Sarah, Emily, and Ben swirling in confusion. Had they been consumed by the house? Was he the last one left? "No," Jonathan whispered hoarsely, wiping his eyes. "I have to find them." The mansion itself seemed alive with malicious intent, the walls groaning in protest. Jonathan pressed forward with every ounce of strength he could muster. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay in one place. The whispering turned into more distorted, echoing sounds, voices speaking over one another, indistinct and twisted. The growling laughter filled the air once again, low and menacing. "You belong here," the voice growled, slipping into his mind like icy tendrils. "You will never leave." Jonathan's heart raced, his breath hitching as panic seized his throat. He stumbled over his own feet, crashing into a wall. The pain of the fall broke his focus for a brief moment, but as he sat up, something beyond reason caught his attention. A faint light flickered in the distance, barely visible in the dark. Hope bloomed briefly in his chest, but the ominous nature of the mansion made it seem dangerous and deceptive. The shadows in the corridor seemed to warp and stretch toward the light, as if they wanted to pull him into the void. He forced himself to move toward the light, his legs shaky beneath him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but the oppressive presence of the house clung to him, making every step heavier. Suddenly, the walls around him twisted in on themselves, and the familiar growling laughter filled the space once more. It seemed to echo louder and louder, as if the house itself was laughing at his desperation. "You can't escape," the voice sneered, louder this time, almost menacing enough to shake Jonathan's very soul. "You will serve us, forever." Jonathan's breath hitched, the weight of those words sinking in deep. The thought of becoming trapped in this nightmare for all eternity was unbearable. "No!" Jonathan screamed, his voice breaking in terror. He collapsed to his knees, gripping his head as the laughter reverberated inside his mind. The shadows loomed closer, stretching hungrily toward him, eager to consume him. But just when it seemed as if Jonathan had reached his breaking point, a voice, weak and faint, called out from deeper in the house. "Jonathan!" The voice was familiar, Ben's voice, though barely audible over the chaos of the house. Hope surged through Jonathan like a wave, giving him the strength to rise. "Ben? Emily? Where are you?" Jonathan shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. The shadows around him seemed to recoil at the sound of his desperation. The laughter faltered for a moment, the whispering voice twisting into something darker, confused and angry. Jonathan didn't hesitate any longer. Guided by Ben's voice, he pushed himself forward, the pain in his chest nearly unbearable as adrenaline and fear coursed through him. Every sound in the mansion seemed to sharpen, scratching, growling, whispering, each echo louder and more twisted than before. The light ahead grew closer, and with it, the hope of finding Ben and Emily, or at least some kind of escape. The twisted corridors finally opened into a larger room, the walls made of ancient, crumbling stone. The flickering light cast strange shapes against the walls, and Jonathan nearly collapsed in relief when he saw Ben, bloodied, bruised, but alive, clinging to a support beam. "Jonathan!" Ben cried, relief washing over his face. "I thought I'd never see you again." Jonathan rushed toward his friend, the tension in his body easing slightly. "We need to get out of here," he said urgently, grabbing Ben's arm. "Where's Emily?" Ben's face fell, panic flickering in his eyes. I don't know," he stammered. "She was here, but something took her." Jonathan's stomach twisted at the thought of losing Emily as well, but there was no time to grieve. The mansion continued to grow darker, the walls pressing closer once more. The shadowed figure from before stood at the far end of the room, eyes glowing brighter than ever. The voice returned, now deeper and more enraged. "Why do you fight?" it roared. "You are ours." The house trembled violently, the shadows surging forward like living beings, hungry and ravenous. Jonathan grabbed Ben tightly, pushing forward toward the only possible exit, an ancient wooden door at the far end of the room. They ran as fast as they could, the darkness snapping at their heels. The mansion itself felt alive, groaning and twisting around them, but somehow they managed to reach the door. Jonathan threw it open, revealing a dim hallway beyond. The faintest glimmer of daylight seeped through, faint but enough to give them hope. They burst out into the daylight, gasping for air, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. Jonathan collapsed onto the ground, the weight of everything crashing down on him. Ben sat beside him, his face pale and trembling. The house behind them twisted and groaned one last time, shadows seeping through the cracks as though reaching for them even from the outside. The door slammed shut, locking itself from within. For a moment there was silence, no laughter, no whispers. The mansion seemed to vanish, swallowed by the shadows. Jonathan and Ben sat in silence, the terror still heavy in the air. Neither spoke, but their eyes met, understanding passing between them. The nightmare was over, for now. But deep down, Jonathan knew it wasn't truly finished. The mansion would always be waiting. As the sun dipped lower behind the mansion, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground, Jonathan and Ben remained motionless, their bodies frozen in a mix of shock and exhaustion. The air around them was thick, charged with a heavy sense of unease, as if the very earth beneath them was still haunted by the house's presence. Ben wiped his face with trembling hands, his breath ragged. "We made it out, right?" His voice cracked, laced with disbelief. "That thing, whatever it was, is gone." Jonathan didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the mansion, the crumbling structure now silent, still, but somehow more menacing in its stillness. He had heard the sounds, faint whispers, indistinct murmurs, coming from the building even after they had escaped, as though the house itself was aware that they had left, but had no intention of letting them truly escape. "Yeah," Jonathan said, finally breaking the silence, his voice hollow. "We're out, but I'm not sure we're safe." Ben gave him a confused look, his face pale from the ordeal. "What do you mean?" "We're out of there, Jonathan. It's over." Jonathan turned to look at him, his expression tight with unease. "I don't know, Ben. It doesn't feel over. I can still feel it. It's like the house. It's still there, watching us." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The reality of what had happened weighed heavily on them both. Emily was gone. They had no idea what had become of her, only the gut-wrenching knowledge that something had taken her in that place, and it had likely claimed countless others before them. The mansion had a life of its own, a dark, ancient force that had been feeding on fear for centuries. Suddenly, the ground beneath them seemed to shift. Jonathan's body went rigid, his eyes darting to the mansion once more. A chill ran down his spine. "Ben, look," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Ben followed Jonathan's gaze, and for the briefest of moments, he thought he saw something move inside the mansion's window. A figure, a silhouette, something or someone watching them. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving nothing but an oppressive emptiness in its place. "Did you see that?" Jonathan asked urgently, his heart racing. Ben nodded, but there was fear in his eyes now, a deep-rooted dread that had never fully left him. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew what Jonathan was thinking. The house hadn't just been a trap, it had been a living thing, a thing that had wanted them, had wanted to feed off them, to take them in as it had so many others. "Let's go," Ben said quickly, his voice shaking. He didn't need to be told twice. They had to leave now, but as they stood to their feet, the ground beneath them shifted again. This time, the earth seemed to tremble with a low, guttural growl, and Jonathan felt something cold and ancient brush against his soul. It was like a voice, not spoken aloud, but a presence deep within his mind. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered, its cold fingers wrapping around his consciousness. "You belong to us now." Jonathan staggered back, his chest tightening as the words echoed inside his skull. He looked around desperately, but there was no sign of Ben. In fact, Ben had vanished. The entire landscape around him had shifted, becoming distorted and alien, as if he was trapped in some nightmarish version of reality. "Ben!" Jonathan shouted, panic clawing at his throat. But there was no answer. The only thing he could hear was the sinister growl of the house, rising in volume. The mansion, or whatever it truly was alive once more, and it was reaching for him. Jonathan stumbled backward, the ground beneath his feet cracking and shifting with every step. His eyes darted to the distance, to where the mansion loomed, its broken windows like dark, hungry eyes. He had to get away. He had to escape. But the closer he moved to the edge of the property, the more the house seemed to pull him back, the air growing thick with something ancient and malevolent. The whispering voice was growing louder, filling his mind with impossible thoughts, tormenting him with twisted images of what awaited him if he didn't comply. "Stop running," the voice growled. "You cannot leave. You are ours." Jonathan's breathing quickened, and his heart raced. He broke into a sprint, pushing himself harder, running faster than he had ever run in his life. But every step he took felt like it was dragging him back, pulling him deeper into the house's grasp. Suddenly, the earth beneath him gave way, and Jonathan fell. He didn't just stumble. He dropped into the darkness, as if the very ground had opened up beneath him. His scream was swallowed by the dark, and the last thing he saw before everything went black was the glowing red eyes of the mansion, staring at him from above. Jonathan's eyes shot open, his heart pounding in his chest. He was back in the mansion, in the same room where they had found the mirror. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the oppressive silence broken only by the low hum of energy in the walls. He gasped, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he pushed himself into a sitting position. His mind raced. What had happened? He had escaped, hadn't he? He had been outside, free. And now? "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "This can't be happening." The room was the same, but it felt different. Darker. The shadows were deeper, colder, as if they were alive. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Jonathan saw something. Someone, standing just beyond the threshold of the door. He spun toward it, his breath catching in his throat. Emily. She stood there, her clothes torn and bloodied, her face pale and haunted. Her eyes were hollow, empty. She looked like a ghost, a shadow of the person she once was. "Emily?" Jonathan choked out, his voice filled with disbelief. But Emily didn't respond. She simply stared at him, her mouth opening to speak, though no sound came from her lips. And then, slowly, she raised her hand, pointing toward the center of the room. Her lips moved, forming words that Jonathan couldn't hear, but he could read them clearly enough in her eyes. "Join us," Emily's ghostly figure seemed to say. The house began to rumble, the shadows shifting and closing in. The walls groaned as if the mansion itself was breathing, slowly, painfully, and hungry. Jonathan couldn't look away. He couldn't breathe. The mansion had never let them go. It had only been waiting for them to return. And now they would be part of it forever. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest, and a cold sweat covered his brow. He couldn't tear his eyes away from Emily's haunting figure. She seemed so distant, so far removed from the person he had known. There was nothing human left in her eyes, just empty, dark voids that reflected the nightmare around them. "Emily," he whispered again, his voice trembling, but the words didn't seem to reach her. She remained still, her outstretched hand pointing toward the center of the room, where a dark, swirling mass of shadows had begun to form. It was like a hole in the fabric of reality itself, a vortex that twisted and pulsed with unnatural energy. The air grew heavier, thicker, as though the very atmosphere was being consumed by this growing darkness. The shadows that clung to the walls seemed to respond, coiling and twisting, like they were alive, feeding off the oppressive presence in the room. Jonathan's legs felt weak, but he forced himself to stand, his body trembling as he took a step toward Emily. But before he could reach her, the ground beneath his feet shifted violently, and he stumbled, nearly losing his balance. The shadows in the room seemed to pull at him, tugging at his very soul, trying to drag him toward the vortex at the center of the room. He gasped for air, struggling to breathe as the darkness seemed to swallow the light in the room, growing heavier with every passing second. "Emily, please!" Jonathan cried out, his voice rising in desperation. "What's happening to you?" She didn't answer. Instead, her form flickered like a broken reflection in water, and for a brief moment, Jonathan saw a flash of her true self, the Emily he had known. But it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had appeared. In that split second, Jonathan understood. This wasn't Emily. Not anymore. The mansion had taken her, and it was now reaching for him. He stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest as the walls around him seemed to close in. The growling, whispering voices, those twisted, insidious sounds, grew louder, more deafening. The darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own, suffocating him, dragging him closer to the center of the room, where the shadows waited to consume him whole. "No!" Jonathan shouted, his voice cracking with terror. The vortex at the center of the room twisted violently, reaching toward him, stretching out like a hungry maw. Emily's figure seemed to flicker again, her eyes hollow, but this time her mouth opened wide, and the sound that escaped was not human. A horrific, guttural screech filled the air, sending a shockwave through Jonathan's entire body. It felt like the very fabric of his mind was being torn apart, like the house was reaching inside him, trying to pull out his soul. "Join us," the voice growled, echoing from every corner of the room, from the walls, the shadows, the very air around him. "You are ours." Jonathan fought with every ounce of strength he had left. His legs were like lead, his body trembling with terror, but he forced himself to turn and run. He didn't know where to go, but he had to get away, had to escape. He bolted for the door, the only exit he could see, and flung it open. The hallway outside was just as dark and twisted as the room behind him. But there was no time to think, no time to stop. The voices followed him, creeping into his mind, dragging him backward with every step. Behind him, the room he had just fled from began to distort and stretch, as if the walls themselves were warping, the house alive, chasing him. "Where are you going?" the voice whispered, far too close. "You can't escape." Jonathan reached the stairs, his feet nearly slipping on the worn wooden steps as he scrambled upwards. His mind raced, the overwhelming sense of dread almost paralyzing. Emily's face flickered in his mind, her eyes empty, her mouth twisted into a sinister smile as the shadows closed in around him. The house was changing, bending, warping as if it had a will of its own, a desire to capture him, to claim him just as it had claimed the others. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding as he reached the top of the stairs. The sound of footsteps, footsteps that weren't his, echoed through the hall behind him, growing louder, closer. Jonathan reached the door at the end of the hallway, his hand trembling as he fumbled for the knob. The voices, the whispers, the growls, they were everywhere, growing louder, drowning out his thoughts, suffocating him. His skin felt like it was crawling, his every nerve on fire. Finally, his hand found the knob, and with a desperate twist, he yanked the door open. It led into another room, dark, but with a faint light in the far corner. A strange, otherworldly light that seemed to beckon him forward. He didn't hesitate. He sprinted into the room, slamming the door shut behind him. His back pressed against it as he panted, his entire body trembling from the exertion and the terror that had consumed him. The light in the corner flickered and hummed, casting an eerie glow on the walls, but it felt different here. Almost safe. For a moment, Jonathan allowed himself to believe that he might have found a way out. Maybe there was a chance to escape the house's grip, a way to break free from whatever dark force had claimed it. But as he looked around the room, his eyes fell on a figure in the corner, a shadow standing still, just barely visible in the dim light. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in clothes that seemed out of place in this time. Jonathan froze, his breath catching in his throat as recognition hit him. The man's face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and dark, staring back at Jonathan with a chilling intensity. And then the man spoke, his voice low and raspy but clear. "Welcome," he said softly. "You finally made it. We've been waiting for you." The darkness in Jonathan's mind deepened. The man's words hung in the air like a curse, and Jonathan could feel it. He had not escaped. He was not free. The house had been waiting for him all along. The shadows in the room seemed to grow, stretching toward him, and the figure moved forward, its eyes glowing red. Jonathan's knees gave way, his body falling to the floor as the reality of the mansion's curse consumed him completely. And then the light flickered out. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as the room around him plunged into complete darkness. The faint glow he had hoped to find safety in vanished, leaving him disoriented and trembling on the cold, wooden floor. The figure, a man or something else, loomed in the shadows, his presence now all-encompassing, suffocating. "You shouldn't have come," the man's voice rasped, his words dripping with malicious intent. "None of you ever should have. Now you belong to us." The words echoed in Jonathan's ears, reverberating through his skull. He pushed himself up, his hands pressing against the floor as he tried to steady himself. His body was heavy with fear, every inch of his being screaming at him to flee. But there was nowhere to run. The room, the house, it was all part of the same nightmare. The walls closed in, the darkness thickening around him. The figure stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. As he emerged from the shadows, Jonathan could make out more details. Pale, sickly skin stretched taut over bones, eyes deep-set and black, devoid of any humanity. The man, or whatever he was, grinned, showing teeth that were unnaturally sharp, yellowed with age. "You're here now," the figure whispered, his breath rancid and cold against Jonathan's face. "And there's no leaving. You've already given yourself to us." Jonathan recoiled, pushing himself back, but his legs felt weak. Every muscle in his body screamed with exhaustion, fear, and the crushing weight of despair. His mind raced, but there were no thoughts that made sense. No logical escape. Only this relentless pull, the mansion, the man, the shadows, everything closing in. "Please," Jonathan gasped, his voice barely audible. "What do you want? Why me? Why us?" The figure tilted its head, his hollow eyes locking onto Jonathan's with a look that chilled him to his core. "You don't understand, do you?" The figure chuckled, the sound hollow and haunting. "We have always been here. The house. The curse. It's been waiting. Waiting for the right souls to claim." Jonathan's pulse quickened. His breathing was shallow, his hands trembling as he pressed them to the floor in an attempt to push himself up. "The others," Jonathan whispered, barely able to form the words. "Where are the others?" The figure chuckled again, the sound like dry leaves rustling in a forgotten graveyard. "They're still here, just like you will be. A part of the mansion's hunger. You think you can escape? No one escapes. Not from this place. Jonathan tried to swallow his panic, tried to gather his thoughts. This was real. The horror wasn't just some figment of imagination. The house, the voices, the figures, they were all part of this curse. He couldn't deny it anymore. I have to get out, Jonathan whispered, though he knew it was futile. The figure stepped closer, his form now so near Jonathan could feel the cold radiating off him. His breath was like ice against Jonathan's skin. The darkness thickened even further, as though it was alive, wrapping around him, suffocating him. Escape? The figure's voice was full of mocking amusement. There is no escape. The house calls to you. It whispers in your mind, it calls your name. The moment you step foot inside, you're bound to it. Forever. Jonathan's mind reeled, and he tried to stand again, ignoring the icy fingers of fear clutching at his heart. No, there has to be a way out. There has to be. The figure stepped back, his grin growing wider. There is no way out. You are already part of the house, and the house is part of you now. The air around Jonathan seemed to grow colder still, the temperature dropping rapidly as the house responded to the figure's words. The shadows deepened, gathering like a storm closing in on him, and Jonathan felt a rush of terror wash over him. Suddenly, the ground beneath him cracked open with a sickening creak, and Jonathan was thrown to the floor as a dark tendril reached up from the ground. It wrapped itself around his ankle, pulling him downward with incredible force. He screamed, trying to claw at the floor, but the shadows had already begun to drag him. No! No! Jonathan cried, his voice a strangled sob. Please! Help! Anyone! But there was no help. Only the hollow laughter of the figure, growing fainter as the shadows closed in around Jonathan. He could feel himself sinking into the floor, his body being swallowed by the dark, as though the mansion itself was devouring him whole. His hands grasped desperately at the air, at the remnants of the floorboards, but nothing was solid. The darkness consumed everything, his vision, his thoughts, his very soul. He felt like he was falling deeper into the heart of the mansion, the whispers and voices growing louder. You will never leave, the figure's voice echoed in his mind. You belong to us now. And as Jonathan was dragged further into the darkness, he could hear something else, a faint, distant scream, too familiar. A woman's voice. Emily? Jonathan's heart lurched at the sound of her name, his thoughts spiraling out of control. Emily, no. But the voice faded, just as quickly as it had come, and Jonathan's world dissolved into blackness. When Jonathan awoke, he wasn't sure how much time had passed. The air was still cold, but there was no movement, no shadows stretching toward him. For a moment, there was only silence, eerie and absolute. He opened his eyes, blinking against the dark, his mind slow to adjust. The room was different, much colder, the walls disintegrating around him, crumbling as though they were ancient ruins. He could barely make out shapes through the gloom. There was a faint, dim light coming from an unseen source, casting long, distorted shadows. Jonathan sat up, his body sore, his heart racing. Something was wrong. The air felt thick, as though it was pressing against him, suffocating him. Suddenly, he heard it again. A whisper, soft but unmistakable, threading through the stillness. You're here, forever. Jonathan froze, the voice filling his head with a sickening, cold dread. It was the same voice, the same darkness. And then, the shape that had once been Emily, now a hollow, twisted reflection of her former self, emerged from the shadows. Emily? Jonathan whispered, his voice barely a breath. But he already knew the truth. The house had won, and there was no escaping the fate it had in store for him. The end was inevitable, and the mansion was hungry. Jonathan's eyes widened as the figure of Emily, if it could still be called Emily, stepped closer to him, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her skin was ashen, her once vibrant eyes now voids of darkness. A cruel, mocking smile twisted her lips, though there was no trace of the woman he had known. the woman he had loved in her expression. "Don't look at me like that," Emily's voice hissed, the sound sharp and broken, like it came from somewhere far away. "You were always meant to be here. We all are. The mansion knows. It always knows." Jonathan's chest tightened. He had known it on some level, but hearing it from her lips made it unbearably real. He had thought that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out, a way to break the curse. But now he understood the terrible truth. This place wasn't just haunted. It was a living, breathing entity, a twisted force that fed on the souls of those who dared to enter. "No, Emily," he whispered, his voice barely a sound. "This isn't you." Her hollow eyes met his, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Jonathan thought he saw a flicker of recognition, a spark of the woman he had known. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that same dark void. "You think I don't know?" Emily's voice was low, almost soothing now, as if she were comforting him in some sick, twisted way. "I was just like you. I didn't believe it either. I thought I could fight it. But the house doesn't let you go. It doesn't let anyone go." Jonathan's throat tightened, the words choking him. "What happened to you? What happened to the others?" Emily tilted her head, her smile widening grotesquely. "They're all here, Jonathan. All of them. The ones who came before us, and the ones who will come after. We're all just pieces of the mansion now. We belong to it." The words hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the house that was cursed. It was the very souls of those trapped within it. They were consumed, lost forever to the darkness, twisted into something else. Something unrecognizable. "No," Jonathan gasped, his eyes wide with horror. I can't stay here. I won't let it." But before he could finish, the room seemed to close in around him. The walls distorted, shifting like liquid, and the shadows grew longer, reaching out as if they had minds of their own. The floor beneath him groaned as if it were alive, shifting and undulating. Jonathan tried to move, but his legs felt like they were sinking into the floor. His heart raced as he looked around, panic rising in his chest. He was being pulled deeper into the mansion, deeper into its insatiable hunger. He felt the pull of the house, its unseen claws digging into his mind, dragging him into its depths. "No! No!" Jonathan screamed, his voice breaking as he tried to fight it. "I won't." But it was no use. The shadows reached for him, the darkness consuming his vision, drowning out everything. He felt a coldness like nothing he had ever known, a suffocating, icy grip around his chest. And then, as if the house itself had swallowed him whole, everything went silent. When Jonathan awoke again, he wasn't sure how much time had passed. It was impossible to tell. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The room he was in, or what was left of it, was bathed in an eerie, pale light, but it did little to illuminate the true horror around him. He was no longer in the same room where he had first encountered Emily. The walls were crumbling, and the floors had given way in several places, leaving large gaps that exposed the darkness below. The shadows seemed to breathe, shifting and whispering. And then he saw them, figures moving in the corners of the room, just beyond the light's reach. His heart raced, but he couldn't look away. The figures were there, and he could feel them watching him. He stood up slowly, his body aching, his mind struggling to keep up with the twisted reality that surrounded him. His thoughts felt slow, distant, as though the mansion was warping them, bending them to its will. The figures grew clearer as he moved, and Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. They were people, twisted, half-formed versions of the investigators who had come before him. Their eyes were hollow, their faces gaunt, as though they had been drained of life. Some were walking, some sitting in unnatural, contorted positions, but all of them shared the same hollow, soulless look. Who are you?" Jonathan asked, his voice a whisper. One of the figures, a man with a deep gash across his forehead, turned to face him. His eyes were black, as though all the color had been drained from them, and his skin had a sickly, grayish hue. "We're what's left," the man rasped, his voice a hoarse whisper that sent a chill down Jonathan's spine. "We were like you. We thought we could survive. But the house, it takes everything." Jonathan stepped back, his heart pounding. "What happened to you? How did you become like this?" The man smiled, but it wasn't a smile. It was a twisted grimace, his mouth stretching far too wide for comfort. "We're part of it now," he said. "Just like you will be. Just like Emily is." "No," Jonathan muttered, his voice trembling with fear. "I can't be. I can't let it." But the man's laugh cut him off, low and chilling. "You already are. Once you step inside, there's no way out. You belong to the house, Jonathan. Just like the others. Just like me." Jonathan's stomach twisted, and for a moment, it felt like the world was spinning out of control. He could feel the mansion's grip tightening around him, pulling him in, consuming him. He tried to move, to escape, but his legs wouldn't obey. The darkness seemed to pull at him, twisting his thoughts, wrapping around him like a cold, suffocating blanket. "You can't fight it," the man said softly, his eyes empty and hollow. "None of us could. We all thought we could leave, but it's too late. The mansion has claimed us, Jonathan. It's too late for you too." And with those words, the figure turned and faded into the shadows, leaving Jonathan alone in the decaying room. But he wasn't really alone. The mansion was with him. The house, the curse, it had him now. As he stood there, his mind reeling with horror, Jonathan knew there was no escaping it. There was no way out. He had crossed the threshold, and the mansion had already begun to claim him. The darkness closed in around him, and Jonathan could feel it. He was no longer just a visitor in this place. He was part of it, just another soul swallowed by the house, lost to its insatiable hunger. And as he fell to his knees, the last shred of his will to fight slipping away, he knew the terrible truth: he would never leave. The house had won. Jonathan's chest tightened as he fell to his knees, the crushing weight of the realization sinking in. The mansion was not just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, a predator that fed on the souls of those foolish enough to enter. The walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the shadows creeping closer as if the house itself were watching, waiting for him to accept his fate. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one a struggle against the growing suffocation in his chest. The once faint whispers had turned into an overwhelming cacophony in his ears, an endless chorus of voices, the trapped souls of the mansion's previous victims calling out to him. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the very air felt thick with dread. "You don't belong here, Jonathan," a voice hissed from the shadows, sending a chill down his spine. The voice was cold, devoid of any compassion or humanity. "But you'll stay anyway, just like the others." Jonathan's head snapped to the side, his eyes wide as he looked around the dark, decaying room. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form indistinct at first, but slowly becoming clearer as it stepped forward. It was a woman, pale, gaunt, her eyes hollow and lifeless like the others, yet somehow more familiar. Who are you?" Jonathan whispered, his voice trembling. He tried to rise to his feet, but his legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed back to the floor. His body felt weak, as if the mansion's dark influence had drained every ounce of energy from him. The woman's face twisted into a cruel, mocking smile. "You don't recognize me, do you?" she sneered. "But I remember you. I remember every detail." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat, the recognition dawning slowly but painfully. He knew her, or he had. She had been part of the investigation team, one of the first to come to the mansion. Her name, he couldn't remember her name, but the memory of her face, of her screams, suddenly flooded back to him. "No," Jonathan gasped, his mind reeling. You're dead." The woman's smile only grew wider. "Dead?" she laughed, her voice echoing in the suffocating silence. "We're all dead here, Jonathan. The mansion doesn't let anyone truly die. It keeps us. It twists us. It keeps us forever." She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his, and Jonathan could feel the cold radiating off her. It was like ice, numbing his skin, freezing the very blood in his veins. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. The shadows seemed to reach for him, to hold him down, preventing him from moving. "You don't understand," the woman said, her voice growing quieter, more sinister. "The mansion doesn't just take your life. It takes everything. Your thoughts, your memories, your soul. We become part of it. We serve it. We are its." Jonathan's mind spun in circles, the words sinking into his brain like poison. He wanted to escape. He needed to escape. But the mansion, it had already consumed him. The thought was unbearable, but deep down he knew it was true. Why are you doing this?" Jonathan whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why does it want us?" The woman's laugh was low, a mocking sound that reverberated in the still air. "Because you're weak," she said, her words venomous. "You think you're different, that you can fight it. But you're all the same. You're all weak. The mansion feeds on weakness, on fear. It thrives on your despair." The shadows around them seemed to grow thicker, swirling in a slow, deliberate dance, closing in on Jonathan. He could feel them tightening around him, like a noose around his throat. The woman's figure began to blur, her form distorting in the darkness. "You think you have a choice, but you don't," she continued, her voice becoming more and more distant. "There's no escaping it. No way out. You'll serve the house, just like the rest of us." Jonathan's chest tightened as the woman's form dissolved into the shadows, her mocking laughter still echoing in his ears. His thoughts were a blur, a whirlwind of panic and fear. He was losing himself, losing his grip on reality. The mansion was taking him. Slowly but surely it was breaking him. And then, just as the shadows were about to consume him entirely, a voice broke through the suffocating silence. "Jonathan!" "No!" It was Emily's voice. Her voice, but it wasn't the same as before. This time, it was filled with desperation, a hint of the woman she had once been. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat, and he looked around frantically, trying to locate the source of the voice. "Emily?" he called out, his voice cracking with emotion. "Where are you? Please help me." He could hear her voice again, faint but clear. "Jonathan, listen to me. You have to fight it. You can't let it take you. You can't become like the others." Jonathan's pulse quickened as he tried to push himself to his feet. The shadows around him seemed to recoil, as though the voice had disturbed them. The oppressive weight on his chest lightened, and for a brief moment, he felt as though he could breathe again. But the relief was short-lived. "You can't escape," the woman's voice, the one that had mocked him, whispered from the darkness, growing louder again. "You think you can fight it? You're already lost." "No," Jonathan whispered fiercely, his hands clenched into fists. "I won't let it have me. I won't let it win." The shadows crept back toward him, and the air grew colder once more. The mansion seemed to hum with dark energy, as if it were reacting to his defiance. But Jonathan stood tall, despite the fear gnawing at his insides. He wasn't going to give in. Not yet. Not without a fight. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath him shook as though the mansion itself was trembling with rage. Jonathan's vision blurred again, but he fought it, holding on to the last shreds of his will. He couldn't afford to lose himself, not now. With a final, desperate cry, Jonathan pushed forward, his heart pounding as he forced himself to move, to fight against the shadows closing in on him. He didn't know how much longer he could hold on, but he wasn't done yet. Not yet. Jonathan's body was heavy, like it was made of stone. Every step felt like he was wading through thick, suffocating mud, the weight of the mansion's oppressive presence pressing down on him. He could feel the shadows trying to latch onto him, to drag him back into the suffocating dark, but he pushed through them with all the strength he had left. "Emily!" he called again, his voice hoarse. The sound of his own desperation almost broke him, but he couldn't stop. He had to keep moving. The walls seemed to shift around him, the rooms twisting into unfamiliar shapes, the hallways stretching and contracting as if the mansion itself were alive, toying with him. But Emily's voice, faint, distant, kept him going. "Jonathan, you have to find me," Emily whispered, her voice echoing through the madness. "Find the heart of the house." The heart of the house? The thought struck Jonathan like a lightning bolt. He didn't know what she meant exactly, but there was a sense of urgency in her words. The mansion had to have a core, a place where its darkness and power originated. If he could find it, maybe he could destroy it. Maybe he could finally end this nightmare. But the house was fighting back. The floor buckled beneath his feet, and the walls began to close in on him. He heard faint whispers, ghostly voices calling his name, trying to pull him into the abyss. "No, I won't listen to you," Jonathan shouted, shaking his head as he stumbled through the corridors, his vision swimming. The mansion felt like it was squeezing the air from his lungs, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift like it was alive. He wasn't just walking through the house anymore. He was inside it, a part of it, and it wanted to consume him. Ahead of him, the hallway stretched into darkness, the walls lined with doors. Each door seemed to call to him in a different voice, promising escape, promising safety, but Jonathan knew better. Every door in this house led to another trap, another piece of the puzzle that would eventually break him. "Find the heart of the house," Emily's voice urged, louder now, clearer. "Hurry, Jonathan." His heart pounded as he approached a door at the end of the hall. It was different from the others. It seemed to hum with a low, vibrating energy, as if it were alive. Jonathan felt an intense pull toward it, something deep within him urging him to open it. He reached for the handle, but as his fingers brushed the cold metal, the door creaked open on its own. A blast of cold air hit him, and the room beyond was shrouded in darkness, but he could sense something there, something alive. Jonathan stepped inside, his senses on high alert, every muscle in his body tensed for whatever might come next. The room was vast, the air thick with the scent of decay and mold. His footsteps echoed as he moved forward, the darkness swallowing him whole. Then suddenly a low, guttural growl filled the air, and Jonathan froze. Something was moving in the shadows, something large and hungry. The growl came again, louder this time, and Jonathan's breath hitched as he spun around, searching for the source. From the darkness, a pair of glowing eyes appeared, fixing on him with an unblinking, predatory stare. Slowly, a shape emerged, tall, skeletal, and terrifying. The creature's body was a grotesque mix of human and shadow, its limbs twisted and elongated, its skin stretched tight over its bones. It moved with a slow, deliberate gait, its claws clicking against the floor with each step. Jonathan's heart raced as the creature advanced, its eyes never leaving him. It seemed to be drawn to him, sensing his fear, reveling in it. He knew then that it was no ordinary ghost. This was something far darker, something born from the mansion's twisted essence. "Jonathan," the creature rasped, its voice a deep, bone-chilling hiss. "You shouldn't have come here. You belong to the house now." The words froze Jonathan in place. The creature was right. He was a part of this place, and the house had already begun to claim him. But he couldn't let it win. Not yet. "Get away from me," Jonathan shouted, his voice a mixture of fear and defiance. He backed away, his hands outstretched as if to ward off the creature. "I'm not going to be your victim. I'm going to end this." The creature's eyes narrowed, its grin widening unnaturally. "You think you can stop it? You think you can defeat us? You're just a pawn, Jonathan. Just another soul to add to the collection." The room seemed to grow colder as the creature took another step forward. Its presence was overwhelming, its dark energy suffocating. Jonathan's chest tightened, and he could feel his resolve starting to waver, but he pushed it aside. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break the curse. Suddenly, Emily's voice cut through the darkness once more, a whisper in the air that seemed to resonate with the walls of the mansion itself. "Jonathan, please, the heart, find the heart." Jonathan's eyes widened, the words from Emily stirring something deep within him. The heart of the house. That was it. He had to find it. The creature, the shadows, the twisted spirits, they were all connected to the house. If he could find its heart and destroy it, maybe he could end the nightmare for good. The creature lunged, but Jonathan barely managed to dive out of the way, narrowly avoiding its sharp claws. The air around him seemed to vibrate with a dark, ancient power. The mansion itself was trying to stop him, to prevent him from finding the heart. But Jonathan wouldn't be deterred. He couldn't give up now. He had come too far. With every ounce of strength he could summon, Jonathan pushed forward, darting past the creature, whose hiss of rage echoed in the darkness. He didn't stop to look back, didn't dare to give in to fear. He had one chance to end this, and he had to take it. His mind raced as he retraced his steps, remembering Emily's words, the urgency in her voice. The heart. It had to be close. He could feel it now, the pull of something ancient, powerful, and dark. It was in the very bones of the mansion. And then ahead of him he saw it. A door different from all the others. This one pulsed with a strange energy, the very air around it humming with power. This was it, the heart of the house. With his heart pounding in his chest, Jonathan reached for the door, the last barrier between him and whatever lay beyond. He couldn't hesitate. He couldn't afford to fail. Jonathan's hand gripped the door handle, his fingers trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what he knew was about to happen. This was it, the final confrontation. He had no idea what awaited him on the other side, but he couldn't turn back now. The house had already marked him, and Emily's voice was still echoing in his mind, urging him forward. He twisted the handle, and the door creaked open, the sound slicing through the thick, oppressive silence that had enveloped the mansion. The room beyond was pitch black, so dark that Jonathan could barely make out anything at all. But as he stepped forward, the air seemed to shift, thickening with an almost tangible energy, a dark force that seemed to draw him in. His senses heightened as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, and then he saw it. At the center of the room, a pulsing, glowing orb hovered in the air. It was small at first, no bigger than a fist, but it radiated an eerie light, casting strange, elongated shadows across the walls. The light was cold, like the light of the moon on a freezing night. But there was something wrong about it. The orb wasn't just glowing, it was alive. It was the heart of the house, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to echo Jonathan's own heartbeat. This was what the house had been leading him to, the source of its power, the key to everything. But as he approached, the shadows around the room began to stir. The walls seemed to breathe, and the temperature plummeted, the air becoming thick with frost. The whispers returned, louder than ever, 1,000 voices blending into one chorus of despair and malice. The mansion was alive, and it was angry. Jonathan, a voice hissed from the shadows, sending a chill crawling up his spine. You should have stayed away. This is our home now. You don't belong here. The creature from earlier appeared again, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness. It was no longer alone. Figures began to materialize in the shadows, ghostly figures twisted and contorted, their eyes empty, their faces locked in expressions of pain and suffering. They were the mansion's past victims, trapped here for eternity, and now they were all closing in on him. But Jonathan didn't stop. He couldn't. He forced his legs to move, each step heavy like walking through molasses. His gaze never wavered from the orb. He could feel its power, a magnetic pull that made his head spin, but he kept his focus. He had to end it. For Emily. For everyone. He reached the orb and extended his hand. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, a searing heat coursed through him, and the house seemed to roar in fury. The shadows lunged, their forms becoming more distinct, more solid, and the creatures began to advance, their skeletal hands reaching out to drag him down. But Jonathan held on. He could hear Emily's voice, soft but clear, urging him to keep going. Do it, Jonathan. It's the only way. He didn't know what he was doing, but something inside him told him to keep pushing. With all his might, he gripped the orb, and the power surged through him like a lightning bolt. He gasped as the energy flowed into his body, filling him with an unnatural strength. The walls around him groaned, the shadows writhing in agony as the orb began to pulse faster, faster, until it was vibrating with a deafening hum. And then, with a final, desperate scream, Jonathan wrenched the orb from the air. The room seemed to explode in a blinding flash of light, and for a moment, everything went still. The oppressive weight that had been crushing him lifted, and the air felt strangely lighter. The walls stopped moving, and the shadows disappeared. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jonathan could breathe freely. He looked down at the orb in his hands, now cold and lifeless, its glow fading. The darkness that had once clung to the room began to dissolve, and with it, the spirits that had tormented him. The mansion groaned one last time, as though it was releasing a final breath, and then, nothing. The silence was deafening. Jonathan stood there, in the middle of the now empty room, the orb still clutched in his hand. His heart was still pounding, but the adrenaline was fading. The terror that had once seemed so real was now just an echo in the back of his mind. The mansion was no longer alive. The curse was broken. He let out a shaky breath, his limbs trembling with exhaustion. He had done it. He had ended the nightmare. But as he turned to leave, a thought crossed his mind. Was it truly over? Suddenly, Emily's voice filled the silence, not from behind him, but from all around him. "Jonathan, you did it." He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. "Emily?" His voice cracked, barely a whisper. "Is it really you?" The air shimmered in front of him, and then, like a mist, Emily's figure appeared. She was different now, her eyes no longer hollow, her face free from the torment that had once consumed her. She was a whole. The dark energy that had once held her captive was gone. She smiled softly, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You freed us. All of us." She stepped closer to him, her form flickering like a candle flame. "But you need to leave. Now. The house won't let you go for long." Jonathan shook his head, confusion flooding his mind. "Leave? But we were free now." Emily's smile faded, and a sad look crossed her face. "This place isn't done with you yet. It will try to pull you back. It always does." Before he could respond, Emily's figure began to flicker and fade, her form dissipating like smoke in the wind. "No!" Jonathan cried out, reaching for her, but she was already gone. The room around him started to blur, the edges of reality warping again. He had to leave. He had to escape before the mansion took him back. With no time to waste, Jonathan ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls, his mind spinning. The mansion seemed to groan one last time, its walls shifting as if it were reaching out for him, desperate to pull him back into its embrace. But Jonathan didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to get out. Jonathan's heart raced as he sprinted down the corridor, the sounds of the mansion warping around him. The floor creaked beneath his feet, and the walls seemed to close in, as if the very structure of the house was contracting, trying to trap him. The air was thick with the stench of rot and decay, but he pushed forward, not daring to look back. He had felt the mansion's pulse before, the suffocating grip it had on him, but now there was something else. A sense of finality. The house was dying. The heart of the house, the orb, was no longer glowing, its power dissipating. But still there was something lingering in the air, a thread of darkness, a remnant of its former strength. His legs burned, and his lungs screamed for air, but Jonathan didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to escape before it pulled him back, before the mansion claimed him like it had claimed so many others. The hallway seemed endless, the oppressive darkness closing in on him. But finally he saw the door. The exit. The way out. He reached for the handle, his fingers slick with sweat. He didn't hesitate. He yanked it open, and the cold night air hit him like a wave. The mansion's grip loosened the moment he stepped outside, the shadows of the house receding like a bad memory. Jonathan staggered out into the front yard, gasping for breath. The air was crisp and clean, the night sky stretching above him, filled with stars. The mansion loomed behind him, its dark silhouette against the horizon, but it felt different. Faint, like a memory fading in the distance. He dropped to his knees, his body shaking from the exertion and the fear that had been coursing through him for what felt like a lifetime. His hands were still trembling, but now it was from relief. He had done it. He had survived. But even as he sat there, trying to catch his breath, a question gnawed at him, one he couldn't shake. What about Emily? Had he really freed her? Or was it just another illusion the house had woven to trick him? He hadn't seen her leave with him. She had disappeared before he could hold her, before he could truly believe she was free. The mansion behind him groaned, and Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. A shiver ran down his spine as he turned his gaze back to the house. The darkness seemed to pulse again, faint but persistent, as if the mansion wasn't finished with him yet. He stood, his legs shaky, and took a step forward, as if the house still had a claim on him. But then he stopped. In the distance, he saw a flicker of movement. A figure standing at the edge of the yard, near the trees, just at the edge of the mansion's shadow. Jonathan's heart stuttered in his chest. "Emily," he called out, his voice barely a whisper, almost too afraid to hope. The figure didn't move at first, but then, slowly, it turned toward him. For a moment, Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. It was her, but something was different. Her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and her face, though familiar, had a hollow, ethereal quality to it. She was no longer the person he had known. She was something else now, something that no longer belonged to this world. "Emily?" Jonathan repeated, his voice full of confusion and fear. "What happened to you?" Emily's lips parted, but her voice, though soft and familiar, had a strange echo to it. "You did what you had to do, Jonathan," she said, her tone distant. "But now we are bound to this place." Jonathan felt his heart sink. "What do you mean?" "I freed you. We were supposed to be free." Her gaze softened, but the sadness in her eyes was deep. "You freed the spirits. You broke the curse. But the house, it has its own will. It takes what it wants. And now it has taken me." "No!" Jonathan shouted, shaking his head. He took a step toward her, but she didn't move. "I can't leave you here. We can't be separated again." Emily's figure flickered, like a flame on the verge of being snuffed out. "You have to live, Jonathan. You have to leave." "I'm not leaving you." His voice cracked, desperation clawing at him. "Please don't leave me." The air around them grew thick again, the mansion's grip returning, pulling at Jonathan's very soul. He could feel the coldness of the place creeping back into his chest, the shadows curling around his feet. He reached out to her, but she took a step back, her form starting to fade. "You've already saved me," she whispered, her voice growing faint. "But I am lost to this place. You have to survive. You have to live." "Emily!" Jonathan screamed, but she was already gone, her figure dissipating into the night air, leaving him standing alone in the yard. The mansion loomed behind him, silent now, but its presence still heavy. Jonathan stood there for a long moment, unable to move, his mind racing. He had broken the curse. He had freed the spirits. But in doing so, he had lost the one person he had fought so hard to save. The mansion was still there, its dark silhouette casting an eerie shadow over the yard, but it no longer felt alive. The pulse that had once driven it had faded, its hunger silenced. For now, at least, the house was at rest. Jonathan took a long, shuddering breath, the weight of everything finally crashing down on him. The terror, the loss, the endless chase, it was over. But he knew deep down that the mansion would never truly release its hold. It would always be a part of him, just as it had been a part of Emily. With one last look at the empty yard, Jonathan turned and walked away, the darkness of the mansion fading into the distance. The world around him was quiet now, but the echoes of the spirits, of Emily's voice, would stay with him forever. And somewhere deep inside, he knew he would never be free of this place. Jonathan's footsteps faltered as he walked away, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He had escaped, but at what cost? Emily was gone. The house was still there, still a looming presence in the distance, like a dark memory that refused to fade. But there was no turning back now. He had to keep moving, keep breathing. As he walked further away from the mansion, the world around him felt off. The night air was still crisp, but it was too still, too silent. There were no sounds of animals, no rustling of trees, no distant hum of civilization. It was as though everything had been sucked into a void, leaving only the emptiness behind. He didn't know how long he walked, but eventually, he found himself standing at the edge of the woods that bordered the mansion's grounds. He had passed through this part of the forest when he first arrived, but now it felt different, darker, as if the trees themselves were watching him, their twisted branches like gnarled fingers reaching out. Jonathan stopped, his breath heavy, and turned to look back at the mansion. It was a dark silhouette against the starless sky, but he could still feel its presence, pressing against him from a distance. A shiver ran down his spine, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still alive, still aware of him. "I did it," he whispered to himself, as if trying to convince his mind. "I broke the curse. I saved Emily." But deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. The mansion had claimed a part of him, something he couldn't explain. The weight of the house's darkness, the spirits' voices, Emily's haunting farewell, they would stay with him, no matter how far he ran. Suddenly, a sound broke the stillness. A soft rustling, barely audible, like something moving in the underbrush. Jonathan's heart leapt into his throat. He turned quickly, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. Silence answered him. For a moment, he stood frozen, straining his ears for any further noise. But the rustling was gone. Jonathan exhaled slowly, trying to calm his nerves, but the unsettling feeling refused to leave. It was as though the woods themselves were alive, watching him with unseen eyes. He forced himself to turn back, to continue walking away from the mansion, but the forest around him seemed to shift, the path twisting in ways that felt wrong. The trees, once familiar, now felt like towering giants, their shadows stretching unnaturally across the ground. Jonathan stopped again, his instincts screaming at him. Something was wrong. The rustling returned, louder this time, coming from behind him. He spun around, expecting to see something, someone, anything, but there was nothing there. Only the trees, standing still in the darkness. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure just beyond the tree line, standing in the shadows. It was a silhouette, humanoid in shape, but its features were blurred, indistinct. Jonathan's heart slammed against his ribs as he stared at it, unable to look away. It didn't move at first. It just stood there watching him. "Emily?" Jonathan whispered, his voice barely audible, but the figure didn't respond. It just stared, its presence an overwhelming pressure on his chest. He took a step back, his pulse racing. He wanted to run, to escape, but his legs felt like lead. The figure seemed to be drawing him in, its form flickering in and out of existence like a mirage. "Please don't," Jonathan murmured, his voice trembling as fear gripped him once again. He had escaped the mansion, but he hadn't escaped its curse. The house, the spirits, they were all still with him, lingering in the shadows. Suddenly, the figure stepped forward, and Jonathan's heart nearly stopped. It wasn't Emily. It wasn't even human. The thing before him was twisted and contorted, its limbs long and unnaturally thin. Its face was a grotesque mockery of a human's, its eyes hollow and black, its mouth stretched into a wide grin that seemed to mock him. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its body flickered like a candle flame in the wind, its form shifting and warping with each passing second. Jonathan stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. "No, no, please." But the creature took another step forward, its grin widening. It was almost as though it was savoring his fear, taking pleasure in his terror. Its eyes glinted with something that could only be described as hunger. A cold, inhuman voice hissed from its mouth. "You thought you could escape? You can never leave. You are ours." Jonathan turned and ran, his legs moving faster than they ever had before. But no matter how quickly he moved, the forest seemed to stretch on forever. The shadows closed in around him, the twisted trees bending and shifting like they were alive, guiding him deeper into the heart of the woods. The creature's laughter echoed behind him, a high-pitched, screeching sound that scraped at his nerves. "Run, little man, run, but you will never escape." Jonathan's breath was ragged, his mind a whirlwind of panic. He couldn't keep running. He couldn't outrun this thing. His foot caught on a root, and he went tumbling to the ground, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. He scrambled to his feet, but the moment he did, he felt a sharp pain in his side. He looked down and saw a dark, inky blackness spreading across his skin like a stain, a mark that was slowly crawling up his body. The curse. The mansion's curse. It hadn't ended. It was never over. Jonathan gasped for air, trying to tear the darkness from his body, but it clung to him, cold and unyielding. His vision blurred, his thoughts fractured. The creature was closing in on him, its laughter growing louder, its twisted grin never faltering. And then, in the distance, he saw a flicker of light. It wasn't much, just a glimmer, like a star shining through the thick canopy of trees. But it was enough to give him hope. With every ounce of strength he had left, Jonathan pushed himself toward the light, his body screaming in protest. The darkness continued to crawl up his skin, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't give in. He had to reach the light. He stumbled forward, his mind focused on nothing but that distant glow, that sliver of hope in the all-encompassing blackness. But as he got closer, the light began to dim. The darkness around him seemed to grow, swallowing it up, until there was nothing but him, the creature, and the eternal night. And then, just as everything began to fade, Jonathan understood the truth. He had never truly escaped. The mansion's curse had followed him. It had claimed him, just as it had claimed all the others before him. And now it would never let him go. Jonathan's last desperate attempt to escape faded into the overwhelming grip of the darkness. The light, that sliver of hope, flickered one last time before being swallowed entirely by the blackness. A cold chill ran through his entire body, and he could feel the curse closing in, tightening around him like a vice. It was as if the house itself, the very mansion he had fought so hard to escape, had stretched its grasp far beyond the grounds, pulling him back into its suffocating grip. His legs refused to move, and his arms hung limply by his sides as the strange inky blackness spread further up his body, its chill seeping into his very soul. His breath came in short, panicked gasps, but it was as though the air itself was thicker here, colder, making it harder to breathe. The creature's laughter grew louder, more frantic, almost as if it had found a twisted joy in watching him struggle. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest, the rhythmic beats drowning out everything else, his own fear swallowing his thoughts. "You can never leave." The voice was low, guttural, and unearthly. It sounded like 1,000 voices layered together, each one filled with malice and hunger. "This house, it takes all who step inside. You thought you could break its power, but there is no escape." Jonathan tried to speak, to fight back, but his voice was drowned out by the overwhelming sensation of cold. His limbs were frozen, and the darkness continued to creep upward until it reached his chest. It was like being swallowed whole by a shadow, each passing moment dragging him deeper into its clutches. But then something happened. In the distance, through the thick fog of terror and despair, Jonathan saw another flicker of light. This one was brighter, more intense. It wasn't just a glimmer, it was a blazing fire, like the sun breaking through a stormy sky. His mind fought against the overwhelming urge to give in, to let the darkness consume him entirely. But that light pulled him like a magnet. He staggered toward it, pushing through the cold and the weight, fighting against the oppressive pressure of the curse. The creature's laugh rang in his ears, but he couldn't stop now. His legs moved on their own, stumbling forward, his vision flickering in and out. With each step, the light grew brighter, clearer. It wasn't just a flicker anymore. It was like a door opening in the middle of the night, a path leading him out of this endless nightmare. The creature hissed, its voice dripping with venom. "You cannot escape." Jonathan's heart raced as he pushed himself harder, every muscle in his body burning with the effort. The blackness still clung to him, the shadows wrapping around his legs, but he wasn't stopping. Not now. Not after everything he had been through. Then, in an instant, the light enveloped him. The darkness was gone, replaced by a warmth that flooded his body. The cold grip of the curse faded, and the oppressive weight that had clung to him lifted, leaving him breathless but free. Jonathan collapsed to his knees, his hands digging into the soft earth beneath him as the light surrounded him like a protective barrier. He looked around in disbelief. He was no longer in the woods. The creature was gone. The mansion, it was far behind him, out of sight. For the first time in what felt like forever, the world around him felt normal, safe. But the question still lingered. Had he truly escaped? Slowly, Jonathan stood, his legs unsteady. The warmth of the light remained, like a faint glow that wrapped around him. He took a step forward, his senses on high alert. He was still terrified, but there was something different now. Something new. The air was clean, and he could hear the distant sounds of wind rustling through leaves. The light felt like a small but steady flame against the lingering dread in his chest. Yet, a sense of unease tugged at him, a whisper at the back of his mind that something wasn't quite right. Suddenly the air shifted. A cold breeze swept through the trees around him, and the light flickered. Jonathan's stomach turned as a familiar, chilling presence swept over him. The mansion was still there. In the distance, just beyond the trees, the dark silhouette loomed against the night sky. The house hadn't disappeared. It hadn't vanished. It was watching him. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he turned back toward the mansion. His heart thundered in his chest, the tension in his body returning full force. The lights from the house seemed to flicker, as if it were alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy. "I thought I escaped," Jonathan whispered under his breath, but his voice was drowned by the wind. "I thought it was over. The house, the mansion, it had never let go of him. It was always going to be a part of him. Even though he had run, even though he had fought against its curse, the truth was clear now. The mansion had claimed his soul, just like it had claimed so many others before him. And now, even if he could walk away, he would never truly be free. He wanted to turn and run again. He wanted to flee into the night, away from the house's gaze. But something deep within him, something that felt ancient and unyielding, told him there was no running from this. There was no escaping the house. It was a part of him, and he was a part of it. As he stared back at the mansion, the ground beneath him shifted. The light around him flickered once more, and the air grew colder. It was as though the mansion had drawn a line in the sand, a boundary that would never be crossed. Jonathan took a step forward, his mind whirling with confusion and despair. He had survived. He had broken the curse, or so he had thought. But now, the truth seemed even darker than before. The mansion was not just a haunted place. It was a living entity, an entity that could never truly be outrun. His heart beat faster as he realized the grim reality. There was no escaping the spirits of the mansion, no escaping the darkness. Not now, not ever. And as the night fell deeper around him, Jonathan understood. The mansion wasn't finished with him yet. It had only just begun. Jonathan stood frozen, his eyes locked onto the dark outline of the mansion. The cold wind swept through the trees once more, and his breath misted in the air. The sense of dread that had haunted him throughout the night came rushing back, this time stronger than ever. The mansion seemed to call to him. Its presence felt like a weight pressing against his chest. He wanted to leave. He wanted to run far away, as far as his legs could carry him. But the thought of turning his back on that cursed house sent a wave of terror through him. He felt as though the mansion's gaze was on him, not just from the distance, but somehow inside his very mind, holding him captive. Jonathan's thoughts swirled, and for a moment he closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath. "You can't outrun this," a voice whispered inside his mind, low and unrelenting. "It will follow you. It will always follow you." The voice was familiar. It was the same voice he had heard in the mansion, just before he had escaped, soft, sinister, and full of malice. The figure in the woods, the one he had seen earlier, watching him from the shadows, was it the mansion's doing? Had it always been there, lurking, waiting for him to return? Jonathan shook his head, trying to block out the growing panic that threatened to overwhelm him. But the longer he stood there, the more the night seemed to warp and twist around him. The trees no longer appeared normal. Their twisted branches seemed to stretch towards him like long, bony fingers, their leaves rustling in a way that sounded almost like whispers. The air felt thick, suffocating, and Jonathan's pulse quickened, the noise in his ears becoming louder with every passing second. His gaze shifted back to the mansion. In the distance, the windows flickered with an eerie light, and he swore he saw movement behind the glass. A shadow, no, not a shadow, a figure. Someone or something was watching him, waiting. His legs moved before his mind could fully catch up, and he found himself walking toward the mansion, drawn as if by some invisible force. He wanted to resist, to turn and run, but his body refused to obey. With each step, the mansion grew larger in his vision, its silhouette dark against the night sky, its windows glowing with an unnatural light. Jonathan's throat tightened, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. He had to face it. He had to face what was inside. If he turned back now, the spirits, the curse, they would follow him forever. They would never stop, never leave him in peace. He reached the front steps of the mansion, the same ones he had climbed earlier that night, and he hesitated. His heart pounded in his chest, and he fought to suppress the wave of nausea that rose in his stomach. But as he lifted his foot to take the first step, the door creaked open, slowly, inviting him in. The cold air that seeped from the cracks in the doorway smelled of dust and decay. It was as if the mansion itself were beckoning him, urging him to step inside, to come back to its dark embrace. Jonathan took a deep breath and stepped forward, the door groaning in protest as it closed behind him. The inside of the mansion was as oppressive as it had been before. The air was thick with dust, the silence suffocating. But there was something else now, something darker. A presence that lingered in the corners, something ancient and hungry, waiting for him to cross the threshold. He could feel its eyes on him, like 1,000 invisible hands reaching out to touch him, to pull him deeper into the house's depths. The mansion had never let go. The spirits hadn't left. They were here, and they were waiting. Jonathan took a hesitant step forward, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the entryway. The floor creaked beneath him, and the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe with every movement. It was as though the house itself were alive, shifting, breathing with him, reacting to his every step. As he walked deeper into the mansion, the sense of dread only intensified. He reached the grand staircase, the one that had once seemed so imposing, but now it felt like a gateway, one that led into the unknown, one that beckoned him into the mansion's heart. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to escape, but his legs carried him up the stairs, each step heavy and reluctant. The upper floor loomed ahead, and as he reached the top, he felt a strange compulsion to move toward the dark hallway that lay beyond. The hallway was long and narrow, lined with doors that led to rooms he had never explored. The air grew colder as he walked, and he could hear faint whispers coming from behind the closed doors. They were muffled, distorted, but Jonathan could make out words, names, pleas, cries, but they didn't make sense. They were the voices of the lost souls, trapped within the walls of this accursed place. He approached the first door on his left, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He didn't know why, but he had to open it. He had to see what lay beyond it, even if it meant facing the horrors that had once haunted him. With a deep breath, Jonathan turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was dimly lit, the shadows playing across the walls. It was a bedroom, small and neglected, with tattered curtains hanging from the window. But the thing that caught Jonathan's eye was the large, ornate mirror that stood against the far wall. It was old, its frame intricately carved with strange symbols that seemed to shift and change when he looked away. The glass was cracked in places, but it still reflected the room in its entirety. But as Jonathan stepped closer to the mirror, he saw something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't his reflection. The figure standing in the mirror was tall, its face obscured by a dark hood, but Jonathan could make out the unmistakable outline of its features. The figure's eyes were empty, hollow voids, its mouth twisted in a permanent grin, and it was staring directly at him. Jonathan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It just stood there, watching him through the glass. Suddenly, a low voice echoed through the room, the same voice that had haunted him earlier, the one that had spoken of the mansion's curse. "You should never have returned," it whispered. "You belong to us now." Jonathan staggered back, his heart racing. He turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. The room around him seemed to close in, the shadows stretching and curling, wrapping around him like a living thing. The figure in the mirror grinned wider, its empty eyes boring into him, and Jonathan realized, with a sickening feeling, that he was no longer alone. The mansion had claimed him, and now it would never let him go. Jonathan's heart thudded in his chest as the realization sank in. He was trapped. The air grew thick with an unnatural heaviness, and the shadows around him twisted and churned, reaching for him with phantom hands. His legs felt weak, his body trembling with fear, but he fought to keep his composure. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break free. He turned to the door, his hand gripping the cold, rusted doorknob with desperate strength. But the door didn't budge. It was locked, sealed tight, as if the mansion itself had decided he was no longer allowed to leave. The whispers, low and menacing, echoed in the room like a chorus of the damned. "You belong to us now," the voice whispered again, sending a chill down his spine. "You can never escape." He could feel the pressure building, the weight of the curse pressing down on him. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, inch by inch, and the room felt smaller, darker, as if the mansion was swallowing him whole. Jonathan's gaze shot back to the mirror, his reflection now replaced with the figure, a tall, gaunt shape with a face hidden behind the shadows of a hood. Its eyes were empty, hollow pits, and the smile that stretched across its face was grotesque, as though the very act of smiling was painful. The figure in the mirror began to move. Slowly its arm lifted, and Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he saw the figure's hand reaching toward him, its long fingers stretching like thin, brittle branches. The figure's lips parted, revealing a mouth filled with sharp, jagged teeth, and it spoke again, its voice filled with an eerie echo. "You should have stayed away," it said, its voice laced with venom. "But now you are ours." The mirror seemed to warp and shift, the reflection distorting, as if the figure was coming through the glass. Jonathan's pulse raced, and he stumbled back in horror, his mind screaming to escape, to find some way out of this nightmare. He turned to face the room once more, frantically searching for an exit, a way to break free from the suffocating grip of the mansion. His eyes darted to the other door in the corner of the room. It was ajar, just a crack, and though the air was thick with tension, he could feel a faint pull, like an unseen force beckoning him toward it. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He rushed to the door, his hand pushing it open with all his strength, and stumbled into the next room. It was another dark, oppressive space, filled with heavy furniture covered in dusty sheets. But there was something different about this room, something far more sinister. A large, dark shape stood in the far corner, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Jonathan's breath hitched as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. It was a tall, thin figure, hunched over with long, tangled hair that obscured its face. The air in the room grew colder as he took a step forward, and a chill crept down his spine. He had seen this figure before. It was the same one that had haunted him in the woods, the one he had glimpsed from the corner of his eye as he had tried to escape the mansion. It was the one that had watched him, waiting for him to return. Suddenly, the figure lifted its head, and Jonathan's blood ran cold. Its face was gaunt and hollow, its eyes empty pits that seemed to draw him in, pulling him closer with an invisible force. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and it let out a low, guttural growl, like the sound of something ancient and hungry. Jonathan tried to move, to run, but his body refused to respond. The air was thick, heavy with the presence of the creature, and he felt as though the very walls of the mansion were closing in on him. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but the fear paralyzed him. The creature took a step toward him, its movements slow and deliberate. It was as though time itself had slowed, and Jonathan could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat deafening in the silence. "You should never have come back," the creature hissed, its voice like the crackling of dry leaves. "The mansion claims all who enter. You are no different." Jonathan could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, the shadows around him closing in tighter, suffocating him. He could feel the spirits of the mansion, the lost souls, reaching out to him from every corner, their whispers growing louder, their touch colder. In a moment of pure panic, Jonathan turned and ran, his legs carrying him through the room as fast as they could, though his feet barely seemed to touch the ground. He pushed past the dark figure, hearing its growl behind him, feeling its presence like a cloud of doom hanging over him. He burst through the door at the other end of the room, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But what he saw on the other side was even worse. The hallway stretched endlessly in front of him, its walls covered in dark, writhing shadows. The doors along the hallway were all closed, but Jonathan could feel them watching him. He could feel the eyes of the mansion upon him, its breath on his neck. There was no escape. He was surrounded. With no other choice, Jonathan ran down the hall, his footsteps echoing off the walls. He had to find a way out. He had to find a way to break free from this nightmare. But as he ran, the shadows around him grew darker, thicker, and the mansion seemed to shift and change, the walls closing in, the floors beneath his feet creaking with each step. The house was alive and watching, its heart beating with every breath he took. Jonathan could feel it now. The mansion wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, and he was trapped inside it, caught in its grip, with no way out. The spirits, the curse, they were all a part of it. They were the mansion's soul, and now, Jonathan was a part of that soul, bound to it for eternity. He stopped at the end of the hallway, panting, his chest heaving with exhaustion. He had nowhere to go, no place to hide. The mansion had him, and there was nothing left to do but face the truth. He was never going to leave. The mansion had claimed him, and now he was a part of its endless darkness, forever bound to its cursed halls. Jonathan's mind was spinning. The walls around him seemed to pulse with a dark, rhythmic energy, almost as though the mansion itself was alive, breathing, watching. His body ached with the terror that gripped him, his every instinct screaming at him to flee, yet his legs felt like lead, unwilling to move. The shadows around him were closing in, and with each passing moment, the air grew thicker, more suffocating. The mansion's whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the spirits were trying to drag him deeper into the house's twisted heart. "You can't escape," the voices hissed. "We are the mansion's soul. You belong to us now." Jonathan's eyes darted around, searching for any possible exit, but the hallway stretched endlessly in front of him, the doors all shut tight, their dark faces staring back at him with hollow emptiness. It was as though the house had no beginning and no end, its corridors looping back on themselves in an endless maze. In the distance, a soft sound echoed through the hall, a faint tapping, like someone tapping a finger against a wooden surface. Jonathan stiffened, his heart pounding as he strained to hear it. It wasn't just the whispers of the spirits this time. It was something more, something real. He turned his head toward the sound, and his eyes narrowed as he saw the silhouette of a figure standing in the darkness ahead. It was tall, too tall, with the same hollow eyes and twisted grin that he had seen in the mirror earlier. But this figure wasn't confined to the glass. It was here, in the flesh, standing right before him. The figure's movements were slow and deliberate, its long, spindly fingers tapping rhythmically against the wall as it took a step closer to him. "You're not alone," the figure whispered in a voice that made Jonathan's skin crawl. "We're all here." A wave of nausea hit Jonathan, and he staggered backward, his body trembling with fear. He had to escape. There had to be a way out. But as he moved, the figure stepped forward, blocking his path. It was as though the mansion itself was closing in around him, preventing him from leaving. The air grew colder, and the figure's grin widened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "You can't outrun us," the figure said, its voice low and menacing. "You can't hide. The mansion has claimed you. You are one of us now." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, as the figure inched closer. The shadows seemed to crawl toward him, swallowing up the light, turning the hallway into a blackened void. And then, just as he thought he couldn't take it any longer, a loud bang echoed through the house, like the sound of a door slamming open. Jonathan's heart raced as the sound grew louder, the footsteps of someone, or something, moving swiftly toward him. The figure in front of him turned sharply, its eyes narrowing as if it had sensed the presence approaching. Jonathan seized the opportunity. His legs moved before his mind could catch up, and he bolted down the hallway, running blindly through the darkness. His breath was ragged, his legs aching, but he couldn't stop. The mansion seemed to stretch on forever, its twisted halls pulling him deeper, its doors never opening, its walls closing in. The pounding of his feet echoed in the empty space, the whispers of the spirits following closely behind. And then, without warning, he collided with something hard. He gasped, looking up to find himself face to face with another figure, one that had been standing in the doorway ahead. This one wasn't like the others. Its features were sharp, angular, its face pale and gaunt. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, filled with a strange, empty sorrow. "You're still running," the figure said in a voice that was both sorrowful and threatening. "You think you can escape, but the mansion never lets go. It never lets any of us go." Jonathan stepped back, his mind racing, trying to process the words. He didn't have time to think. He had to keep running, had to keep moving. But every direction he turned, he found himself face to face with another figure, another shadow from the mansion's dark past. They were everywhere, watching him, waiting for him to break, to surrender. The figure's hand reached out, long, skeletal fingers brushing against his arm. Jonathan flinched, pulling away, but the touch lingered. The coldness of it seeped into his skin, into his very bones, and for a moment, he thought he could feel the pulse of the mansion within him, as if the house itself were trying to draw him in, to claim him as its own. The figure's lips curled into a grin, its hollow eyes glowing with an eerie light. "There is no escape. You're part of us now. You will always be part of us." With a cry, Jonathan pulled away from the figure, his feet carrying him down the hallway once more. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. He just had to get away from the shadows, from the figures that followed him, from the whispers that gnawed at his sanity. But the further he ran, the more distorted the mansion became. The walls seemed to bend and warp, the hallway stretching longer and longer with each step. The air grew colder still, and the shadows twisted and shifted, taking on shapes and forms that made his heart race. The mansion was changing, adapting to his every move. The spirits were guiding him deeper into its labyrinth, leading him further into the depths of its cursed soul. Jonathan had no idea how long he had been running, or how many times he had turned down unfamiliar hallways. But when he finally stumbled into a small, dimly lit room, he realized it was too late. There was nowhere to go anymore. He was back at the beginning. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. The room, small and empty, seemed to close in around him, its walls pressing inward. His breath came in shallow gasps as the shadows swirled, the whispers growing louder, filling his mind. "You belong to us," the voices echoed. "You always have." Jonathan turned in circles, his mind unraveling as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He couldn't escape. The mansion wouldn't let him. It had him trapped, bound to its dark heart. And then in the corner of the room he saw it, another mirror, framed in ornate wood, cracked and worn. But this time, it wasn't just his reflection staring back at him. The figure from before, the one he had seen in the mirror earlier, stood behind him in the glass. Its smile was wider now, more twisted, and its hollow eyes gleamed with a dark, malicious light. Jonathan's heart stopped in that moment. The figure's hand reached forward from the glass, its fingers curling as if to touch him. And as the figure's hand made contact with the surface of the mirror, a cold, icy sensation spread through Jonathan's chest. The mansion had claimed him, just as it had claimed the others before him. And now he was part of it, forever lost in the dark heart of the house, a spirit bound to its eternal curse. As Jonathan's chest tightened, the cold spreading from his chest to his limbs, he could feel the crushing weight of the mansion's presence. The mirror, now an oppressive black void, seemed to pull at him, tugging him closer. The figure in the glass began to move, its arms reaching out, long and spectral, as though it were trying to drag him through the surface. His breath came in ragged gasps, his hands trembling. Every instinct in him screamed to run, to escape, but the floor beneath him felt like it was sinking, as if the very foundation of the house was giving way. The walls pressed in tighter, the air suffocating, and the shadows shifted, taking on grotesque forms, whispering their dark promises. "You're not going anywhere," the voice from the mirror hissed, its tone low and mocking. "This is your fate now. The house has claimed you, Jonathan." The words twisted in his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a vice. He could feel the darkness inside the mansion, its soul bleeding through the cracks, seeping into his own. The coldness crawled deeper, invading his veins, and he could hear the distant sounds of the other spirits, lost souls trapped here for eternity, their cries echoing through the walls. His hands grasped at his chest, as though trying to stop the chill from spreading further. His mind raced, the thoughts fragmented. Was this it? Was this how it all ended? A part of him wanted to surrender, to let the house have him. But another part, the last shred of who he was, refused. He couldn't let it end like this. With a desperate gasp, Jonathan lunged away from the mirror, his feet slipping on the cold floor. He turned, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of escape, any door, any crack in the walls. But the room had changed. The door he had entered through was now sealed tight, the walls warped and twisted, pulsating as if alive, as though the mansion itself were feeding on his fear. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices, all calling to him at once. "Stay with us. You belong to us. Don't fight it." His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground, his hands clutching his head, trying to block out the endless barrage of voices. He could feel them, feel the spirits, the trapped souls, all of them pushing against his mind, trying to take control. And then, through the chaos of his thoughts, he heard it. A faint, distant sound, a voice weak but familiar. "Jonathan." He looked up, his heart skipping a beat. The voice, it wasn't from the spirits. It wasn't the mansion. It was human. "Help me." Jonathan scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He wasn't alone. There was someone else. His eyes darted around the room, but he couldn't see where the voice was coming from. It echoed in the empty space, bouncing off the walls, and yet it felt close, so close. His instincts told him to follow the voice, to trust it. But the shadows were thick now, swirling around him, and he could hear the deep growls of the mansion's inhabitants. The house was alive, and it was furious. It didn't want him to escape. It wanted him to stay, wanted him to become part of its endless nightmare. "You're not the first," a voice rumbled from the corner of the room. A figure stepped from the shadows, tall and gaunt, its skin a pale, waxy gray, its face contorted with a grotesque smile. It was one of the spirits, but this one was different. There was a sense of awareness, a sense of purpose in its eyes. Jonathan backed away, his chest tightening with fear. This wasn't like the others. This spirit was far older, its power much greater. It stepped closer, its footsteps slow and deliberate, and the temperature in the room dropped even further. "You hear the voice, don't you?" the figure crooned, its voice low and mocking. "The one that calls you to escape, to leave. But you can't. You'll never leave." Jonathan's heart hammered in his chest. "No," he thought. "I can't stay here. I can't let it take me." With a surge of determination, he turned away from the spirit, ignoring the coldness that clawed at his skin, and pushed against the walls, trying to force his way through the shifting darkness. The mansion groaned around him, its foundation shaking as if it were about to collapse. The voice, the familiar one, echoed again, stronger this time. "Jonathan!" He turned, his eyes wide. It was coming from behind a thick, curtained doorway on the far side of the room. He didn't hesitate. He moved toward it, ignoring the shadows that reached for him with icy fingers, ignoring the spirit that howled in fury behind him. He threw open the door. The room beyond was dimly lit, the air heavy and thick with dust. At first, he saw nothing but empty furniture covered in sheets. But then a shape appeared at the far end, a figure hunched over, trembling, its back turned to him. "Who's there?" Jonathan called out, his voice shaky but desperate. The figure turned slowly, revealing the face of a man, pale and gaunt, eyes wide with fear. Jonathan felt his blood run cold as he recognized him. It was Thomas, the man who had vanished before Jonathan arrived at the mansion. Thomas's lips trembled as he met Jonathan's gaze, his eyes filled with terror. "They're all here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The spirits, they're taking us. I thought I was free, but it's all the same. They'll come for you too." Jonathan's stomach churned as Thomas's words echoed in his mind. He could feel the weight of the spirits pressing down on him, their presence closing in. Thomas was right, there was no escape. The mansion had claimed him, just like it had claimed Thomas, just like it had claimed everyone else who had entered. Jonathan took a step forward, his hand reaching out for Thomas. But the moment his fingers brushed Thomas's arm, the man gasped and fell backward, his body convulsing violently. "No!" Jonathan shouted, but it was too late. Thomas's body twisted, contorted in unnatural ways, as his face transformed into a grotesque mask of agony. His eyes rolled back in his head, and a terrible scream tore from his throat, a scream that was joined by the other voices of the mansion. The spirits, now fully revealed, swarmed from the walls, the shadows, their forms twisting and writhing as they enveloped Thomas's body. Jonathan stumbled back, his hands raised in defense, but it was too late. The darkness closed in on him. The mansion had him now. He was one of them. The room grew unbearably cold as the spirits surrounded him, their presence pressing down on him like a physical weight. The shadows twisted around Jonathan, their forms becoming more grotesque, more monstrous, as if they were feeding on his fear. Their whispers grew louder, filling his ears with maddening voices. "You belong to us now," they whispered in unison, their voices like a chorus of lost souls. "You can never leave." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing for a way out. But there was no escape. The walls seemed to close in around him, the very air thick with the suffocating presence of the mansion's inhabitants. His vision blurred, his thoughts clouded by the overwhelming sense of dread. He could feel the spirits, their icy fingers brushing against his skin, crawling under his clothes, their touch cold and seeping through his very bones. The figure of Thomas, now nothing more than a twisted, contorted shadow, was still writhing on the floor, his screams echoing in Jonathan's mind. "Help me," Thomas's voice croaked, though it no longer seemed like Thomas at all. It was something else, something that had taken his body, his soul. They're going to take you too." Jonathan staggered backward, his legs shaking beneath him. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. The spirits closed in on him, their ethereal forms blurring with the shadows, their hands reaching out for him, pulling at him, drawing him closer to the darkness. He couldn't escape. He was trapped, caught in the grip of the mansion's dark heart. The very air was alive with the energy of the spirits, their presence suffocating him, drowning him in despair. There was no door, no window, no way to escape the nightmare that had claimed him. Suddenly, one of the spirits lunged at him, its cold fingers gripping his arm. Jonathan gasped in pain as the touch sent a shockwave of ice through his veins. The spirit's face was nothing but a hollow, empty void, its eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. It grinned at him, its jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light. "Welcome home," it whispered, its voice like a rasping breath, a death rattle in his ear. "You'll never leave. You'll never be free." The spirit's fingers tightened around his arm, and Jonathan felt a surge of cold fill his chest, as if his very life force were being drained away. His vision began to blur, his knees buckling under the pressure. His body was weakening, succumbing to the spirit's power. But in that moment, a spark of clarity cut through the fog of fear. Jonathan's mind flashed back to the mirror, the one he had seen in the hall earlier. The figure in the glass, the twisted face that had smiled at him. "The house," he whispered, the words barely a breath. "The house is the key." He remembered the way the mirror had seemed to pull him in, the way the figure had reached out from the glass. It wasn't just a reflection, it was part of the house, a part of the mansion's dark soul. If he could somehow confront the mirror, confront the darkness within, he might have a chance to break free. With every ounce of strength he had left, Jonathan tore himself away from the spirit's grasp. The coldness that had spread through his body resisted, but he fought against it, forcing himself to move. He stumbled toward the door, his legs weak, his breath shallow, but he couldn't stop now. He had to reach the mirror. It was his only chance. The spirits shrieked in anger as he made his way toward the hallway, but Jonathan pushed forward, ignoring their cries, the icy chill that nipped at his skin. The mansion seemed to groan in fury, its walls shaking, its very foundation trembling, as if it knew what he intended to do. As he reached the hallway, the figure in the mirror flashed through his mind again. He had to confront it, had to face it head on. If he could somehow shatter the mirror, maybe the spirits would lose their hold on him. The hall seemed to stretch endlessly before him, each step dragging him further into the nightmare. The shadows were alive, moving with a mind of their own, but Jonathan pressed on, determined to reach the room where he had first seen the mirror. His heart raced as he finally reached the room, the door creaking open with an eerie groan. The mirror stood in the center of the room, its surface dark and reflective, as though it were waiting for him. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he saw the figure in the glass, his own reflection but twisted. The grin on his face was wide, unnatural, and his eyes gleamed with an unsettling light. The figure in the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was him, or rather, a version of him that had been consumed by the mansion's darkness. "You can't escape," the reflection whispered, its voice distorted, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "You are part of us now." Jonathan took a deep breath, his fingers trembling as they reached for the mirror's edge. The spirits' whispers grew louder, their anger rising, but Jonathan steeled himself. This was the moment. He had to destroy the mirror, destroy the mansion's power. With a scream of fury, he slammed his fist into the mirror's surface. The glass shattered, sending a wave of energy rippling through the room. The spirits howled in agony, their forms flickering in and out of existence. Jonathan felt a rush of heat and cold sweep over him. his body shaking violently as the mansion seemed to convulse around him. But he didn't stop. He kept striking the glass, each blow sending a shockwave of power through the room. The spirits writhed in pain, their forms dissolving, their voices turning to screams of anguish. And then, with one final, deafening crack, the mirror shattered completely. The room fell silent. Jonathan stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. The spirits were gone. The mansion was still. The air was thick with the remnants of their presence, but the weight of the house's power had lifted. For a moment, there was nothing but stillness. And then, slowly, Jonathan realized that he was no longer alone. A figure stepped from the shadows, its face shrouded in darkness. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the form. It was Thomas. But this time, Thomas wasn't twisted or contorted. He was whole again, his eyes clear, his face calm. "You did it," Thomas whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. "You broke the curse. You freed us." Jonathan looked around, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. The spirits were gone. The mansion was silent. "But what about the others?" Jonathan asked, his voice trembling. "They're free now," Thomas said softly. "They've all been released. The mansion has lost its hold on us." Jonathan's legs buckled beneath him as the weight of it all hit him. He had done it. He had broken the curse. The spirits were gone. The mansion was finally free of its dark power. And he too was free. But as he stood there, surrounded by the remnants of the haunted house, Jonathan couldn't help but wonder, what would become of him now? Jonathan stood in the dim light, his mind still reeling from the events that had just transpired. The silence that enveloped the mansion felt foreign, almost unnatural after the constant whispers and terrifying presence of the spirits. It was as if the very air had shifted, now heavy with a strange peace. But beneath that calm, Jonathan could still feel the weight of the mansion's past. He looked around, half expecting to see shadows creeping in the corners of the room, or the spirits' faces flickering in the darkness. But there was nothing, just the stillness, broken only by his own ragged breaths. "How is this possible?" he whispered to Thomas, still trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. He had expected destruction, chaos, or even his own demise after breaking the mirror. Yet here he stood, untouched by the darkness that had nearly consumed him. Thomas, standing near the broken mirror, watched Jonathan with an unreadable expression. His once worried eyes had a faint glimmer of peace in them, though there was a sorrow that lingered, sorrow that seemed to be woven into the very fabric of the mansion itself. "You did it, Jonathan," Thomas repeated, a quiet pride in his voice. "You broke the curse. No one has ever been able to do that before." Jonathan felt a pang of guilt at the mention of the others. The other souls that had been trapped within the mansion's walls. Had they truly been freed? Were they all at peace now? What about them? Jonathan asked, his voice faltering. The other spirits, the ones that, they weren't just trapped, were they? They were lost. Angry, Thomas's face darkened, and he nodded slowly. Some were lost to madness. Some, they had been in this house for so long that they became a part of it. Their anger, their pain, it was what kept the house alive. He paused, his gaze distant. But not all of them were evil. Some were just victims, victims of the mansion's darkness, just like we were. Jonathan absorbed this, his mind trying to piece together the true nature of the mansion and its cursed history. The house had been a place of suffering, a place where souls were trapped for eternity, their pain feeding the dark force that controlled it. The spirits had been tortured, some for centuries, until they became twisted by their torment. He glanced back at the shattered mirror, its fragments scattered across the floor like shards of a broken reality. The mirror had been the mansion's heart, its gateway, and now it was destroyed. But was that enough? Could he truly leave, knowing that there was a chance the curse could return? Is it over? Jonathan asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Thomas met his gaze, his eyes filled with an ancient sorrow. No one knows. The house has been silent for the first time in centuries. But darkness like this, it never truly disappears. It lingers, waiting for a chance to return. Jonathan's heart sank. He had done everything he could to destroy the curse, but the doubt gnawed at him. The mansion had been alive with malevolent energy, feeding off the souls trapped inside it. He could still feel it, the faintest pulse, like the last remnants of the curse, still lingering in the walls. Could it return? But before he could voice his concerns, a sharp, distant sound echoed through the mansion, a low, rumbling groan that reverberated through the walls. Jonathan froze, his heart skipping a beat. The sound grew louder, almost like the mansion itself was waking up. "What is that?" Jonathan asked, his voice trembling. Thomas's expression shifted, his face pale. "The house isn't dead. It's waking up. Something is coming." Jonathan felt a surge of panic rise in his chest. He had thought he had destroyed the source of the house's power, but it seemed he was wrong. There was something else. Something still within the mansion. Something powerful that had been lying dormant all this time. The rumbling grew louder, shaking the floor beneath their feet. The walls groaned, and dust fell from the ceiling as though the mansion was shifting. Jonathan's pulse quickened. He needed to leave. The air was thick with an energy he couldn't explain, a presence that made his skin crawl. Without warning, the door to the room slammed shut, trapping them inside. Jonathan rushed to it, his heart racing as he tried to force it open. But the door refused to budge, the wood creaking under the pressure, as if something was holding it closed. "It's not over," Thomas whispered, his voice filled with dread. "Whatever is left inside the mansion, it's waking up. And it's angry." Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. What had he missed? Had breaking the mirror disturbed something deeper, something older, than the spirits themselves? Before he could say anything, the room plunged into darkness. The light from the broken mirror was extinguished, and the air seemed to freeze. The temperature dropped rapidly, sending a wave of frost creeping over the floor, spreading like an infection. Jonathan's breath came out in visible puffs as the cold swallowed the room whole. The whispers returned, low, guttural, and unintelligible. But now they were different. They were not just the lost souls of the mansion, but something older, something darker, clawing its way back to life. A shadow stretched across the room, dark and formless. It was massive, its presence suffocating. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as he backed away, his feet stumbling over the debris on the floor. Then, in the center of the darkness, a pair of glowing eyes appeared, deep, endless pools of black that seemed to suck in all the light around them. The eyes glowed with an otherworldly power, radiating malice and hatred. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He had seen those eyes before, in the reflection of the mirror, in the shadows that had haunted the mansion's halls. "You have disturbed me," the voice rumbled, deep and guttural, vibrating the very air around them. It was a voice that came from the walls, from the ground, from everywhere. "And now, you will pay." The dark figure moved closer, the air around it swirling, warping. Jonathan could feel the temperature drop further, the darkness pressing in from all sides, closing in on him like a tomb. It was the heart of the mansion, the source of its curse, and it was awake now. The shadow lunged toward him. "Run," Thomas whispered, his face pale. "You have to run, Jonathan. It's the only way." Without thinking, Jonathan turned and bolted toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was thick with darkness, the ground beneath his feet shaking with every step. The mansion was alive again, and it would not let them go. Jonathan sprinted down the hallway, his legs pumping, his breath ragged as he ran through the oppressive darkness. The shadows seemed to follow him, crawling along the walls, reaching for him like phantom hands. The rumbling from deep within the mansion had intensified, as though the very foundation of the house was shaking with rage. He didn't dare look back. The air around him was thick with the weight of unseen eyes, and the low growl of the dark entity followed him like a predator, stalking him from the shadows. The temperature had dropped so low that his teeth chattered, his body trembling with the cold. Every step felt as though the mansion itself was trying to pull him down, to stop him from escaping. He reached the staircase and bolted up it, his feet slipping on the old wooden steps. He could hear the haunting whispers growing louder, surrounding him from all sides. It was as if the mansion was alive again, feeding off his fear, pushing him toward the brink of madness. "Where are you going?" The voice rumbled from the shadows, low and menacing. "You cannot escape. You are mine." Jonathan's heart raced faster. He reached the top of the stairs and stumbled down the long corridor, his mind desperately searching for a way out. He needed to get to the front door, to break free from the mansion's grasp. But the house seemed endless, its layout shifting, warping with each step he took. The air felt suffocating, and he could feel the darkness closing in on him. He glanced over his shoulder, a cold sweat dripping down his face as he saw the shadowy figure moving closer, its glowing eyes fixed on him with predatory intent. "Run, Jonathan!" Thomas's voice echoed in his mind, a warning, a plea. "It will never let you leave unless you face it." Face it! Jonathan's thoughts screamed in panic as the weight of Thomas's words hit him. Could he really face whatever this dark force was? Had he already destroyed the curse, or had he only woken something even more terrible? He reached the end of the corridor, but there was no exit, no door, no window. The hallway stretched out into infinity, the walls closing in, suffocating him with their oppressive weight. His breath caught in his throat. He was trapped. There was no way out. Suddenly, a door appeared in front of him, its wood old and weathered, yet somehow familiar. Jonathan froze. He knew this door. It was the door to the room with the mirror, the heart of the mansion's power, the room where it had all started. Without thinking, he grabbed the door handle and yanked it open, stepping inside. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the faintest glow of the shattered mirror's remains. The fragments of glass glistened like broken stars on the floor. Jonathan's pulse quickened as he entered, his feet crunching against the shards of glass. The air felt thick, like the room was alive with an unseen force. His eyes searched the room frantically, but he couldn't see anything clearly, just the faint glow of the fragments illuminating the space. "You're not leaving," the voice boomed, filling the room with its oppressive tone. "You're mine now." Jonathan spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice. But there was nothing in the room except the broken mirror's remains. The shadows seemed to be closing in on him from all sides, whispering his name, urging him to surrender to them. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized the truth. The house hadn't just been cursed by the spirits, it had been cursed by the darkness itself. It wasn't just a place where the souls of the dead were trapped. It was a vessel for something much older, much more powerful. The mansion was alive. It was a thing of malevolent will feeding off fear, anger, and despair. And now that it had awoken, it wouldn't stop until it had claimed everything and everyone inside. Desperation gripped Jonathan's heart. He couldn't stay here. He had to destroy it, to stop it once and for all. But how? In the corner of his vision, something shifted. A shape, a movement in the darkness. Jonathan's breath hitched as he turned his head. Standing there, amidst the shadows, was a figure, an old woman, draped in tattered robes, her long, silver hair flowing like a veil around her face. Her eyes were glowing a bright, unsettling white. The woman raised her hand, her fingers curling toward him, as though beckoning him closer. Jonathan's pulse raced, his legs frozen in place. He knew instinctively that she was no mere spirit. She was the source of the darkness. She was the one who had bound the spirits to this place, who had given the mansion its terrible power. "You cannot escape," the woman's voice hissed, her mouth moving in sync with the whispering shadows. "You are mine. All of you are mine." Jonathan's mind screamed, his fear threatening to overwhelm him. But in the midst of his panic, a flicker of clarity pierced through the fog of terror. He remembered something. The book, the journal he had found. There had been a mention of a ritual, something to banish the darkness, to sever the ties that bound the mansion's evil to the world of the living. But where was it? He couldn't remember all the details. The journal had been too cryptic, too fragmented. He needed something to fight back with, something to break the curse once and for all. As the woman's form seemed to shift and blur, the shadows swirling around her, Jonathan's eyes darted to the mirror's shards on the floor. A plan began to form in his mind. "You cannot stop me," the woman sneered. Her figure loomed closer, her hand reaching for him. "You belong to me. This is your fate." But Jonathan didn't back away. He stepped toward the mirror shards, his heart thundering in his chest. He knelt down, his hands trembling as he picked up the largest piece, the sharp edges glinting in the dim light. He had no idea if this would work, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. The woman was too powerful, the mansion's curse too strong. He needed to act now. With a deep breath, he held the shard up, positioning it as if it were a weapon. The shadows closed in, the woman's shrill laughter echoing in his ears. And then, with all his strength, Jonathan hurled the shard into the air, toward the center of the room, where the darkness was most concentrated. A blinding flash erupted from the point where the shard landed. For a brief, terrifying moment, everything went white. Jonathan squeezed his eyes shut, his body tensing in fear, unable to see what was happening. And then, just as suddenly, the light vanished. The room was silent. The darkness had lifted. Jonathan opened his eyes. The woman was gone. The shadows were no longer twisting and writhing. The air felt lighter, almost normal again. But the house was still there, and Jonathan knew it would never truly be free from its grip. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, filling the room with an eerie stillness that felt wrong after the chaos. Jonathan stood motionless, his heart hammering in his chest. He could feel the lingering presence of the mansion, its ancient walls still breathing in the quiet. But for the first time since he entered, it didn't feel like the house was closing in on him. He took a cautious step forward, his breath shallow, scanning the room. The mirror shards were scattered across the floor, their once glimmering surfaces now dull and lifeless. The remnants of the shattered glass had lost their glow, leaving only the jagged edges in the pale, fading light. But there was something different. Something was missing. The oppressive weight that had pressed on him, suffocating him from all sides, had lifted. The shadows, once alive with malicious intent, had receded into nothingness. It was as if the very essence of the house had been momentarily drained of its malevolent energy. "It's over," Jonathan whispered to himself, his voice shaky, though he couldn't bring himself to believe it completely. Could it really be over? Could the mansion, with all its evil and history, have been brought to an end with nothing more than a single act of defiance? The thought seemed impossible, but as he stood in the quiet, he couldn't deny the absence of the chilling presence that had haunted him for so long. Suddenly, the faintest sound reached his ears, a soft tapping, almost imperceptible, coming from the far corner of the room. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat, and he turned his head, instinctively backing away from the noise. It was subtle at first, but then it grew louder, more distinct. Tap, tap, tap. He squinted into the darkness, his eyes desperately trying to make out the source. And then, as if it was always there, he saw it, a figure standing motionless by the far wall, its back turned to him. Jonathan's blood ran cold. The figure was shrouded in shadow, but there was no mistaking the silhouette of a woman. Her hair was long and wild, hanging loose around her shoulders, and she stood unnaturally still, as though waiting for something. For a moment, Jonathan froze. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, his mind caught in a web of fear and confusion. Was she another spirit? A remnant of the curse? Was she something even worse than what he had already faced? The tapping noise continued, rhythmic and unsettling, like the ticking of a clock winding down. It echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls and ringing in Jonathan's ears, driving him to the brink of madness. He had to make a choice, approach or run. Before he could decide, the woman turned. Jonathan's blood turned to ice as he met her gaze. Her eyes were black voids, empty, hollow pits that seemed to suck in the light around them, drawing his very soul into their depths. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with dark veins running across her skin like spider webs. Her lips parted, and though her mouth moved, no sound came out. Only the tapping, louder now, louder than before. The woman began to step toward him, slowly, deliberately, her feet making no sound as they touched the floor. Each step seemed to blur the line between the physical world and something else, something darker. "Why are you here?" Jonathan whispered, his voice barely audible. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised one of her arms, pointing at him with a long, skeletal finger. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping so fast that Jonathan could see his breath in the air, swirling in front of him like fog. Then, with a movement as quick and fluid as a predator's strike, the woman lunged. Jonathan barely had time to react. He stumbled back, his heart racing, as he desperately scrambled to avoid her grasp. But she was too fast. Her cold fingers brushed his skin, and in that instant, a wave of icy dread swept over him. It was as if her touch reached into his very soul, draining him, pulling him into the depths of despair. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. Every muscle in his body locked up with fear, his mind struggling to break free from the overwhelming terror. And then, just as quickly as she had come, the woman stopped. Her fingers hovered above his chest, and she let out a sound, a low, gurgling laugh that filled the room like poison. "You are nothing," she whispered, her voice a twisted mockery of human speech. "You can never escape. None of you ever can." The woman took a step back, still grinning, her eyes locked onto his with an unblinking, hollow stare. Jonathan's heart pounded in his ears as he realized what she was. A part of the mansion, a manifestation of its evil. The spirit of the woman, twisted and corrupted over centuries of suffering, had come back to claim him. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his knees threatened to buckle beneath him. But even in the face of this terrifying figure, something stirred within him. He couldn't let this house win. He couldn't let this darkness claim him, as it had claimed so many before him. With a final burst of strength, Jonathan lunged forward. His hand gripped a shard of glass from the broken mirror on the floor, and without thinking, he swung it at the woman's form, aiming for the space where her heart would be. The glass struck her chest with a sickening crack. For a moment, nothing happened. The woman's smile faltered, and then her body seemed to ripple, as though the shard had pierced something other than flesh. The shadows around her flared and twisted violently, her form flickering like a broken image on a screen. Then, she let out a blood-curdling scream, a sound that reverberated through the very walls of the mansion. Her body writhed, disintegrating into a mass of writhing black tendrils that lashed out at Jonathan, trying to drag him into the darkness. Jonathan stumbled back, his hands shaking as he dropped the shard. The room began to twist and contort, the walls warping, the ceiling cracking open as though the very structure of the house was collapsing around him. But amidst the chaos, there was a shift, a sudden light that filled the room, bright and pure. The shadows screamed, fading away into nothingness. The woman's presence, the malevolent force that had haunted the mansion for so long, dissolved in a flash of light. And then the room was still again. Jonathan stood alone, gasping for air, his heart still pounding. The darkness had receded, leaving only silence in its wake. But was it truly gone? As the light flickered out and the mansion began to settle, Jonathan knew that the curse was far from over. The house had been defeated, but not completely. It was only a matter of time before it would try to rise again. Jonathan's legs trembled beneath him, his body on the edge of collapse, yet his mind raced. He knew the danger wasn't over. It wasn't over because the mansion itself was the curse. It fed off fear, misery, and death, And just because the entity had vanished didn't mean the house would give up so easily. This mansion had a life of its own, and as much as he wanted to believe the horrors were behind him, he couldn't ignore the chilling sensation that gripped him. He was still trapped within its walls. Slowly, he began to move, his feet hesitant, as though each step might trigger a fresh wave of terror. The room felt impossibly quiet. Even the faintest whisper seemed to echo through the space. His breath came out in ragged gasps, the cool air of the room feeling oppressive now, too thick, as if the house was watching him, waiting for him to slip, to make one mistake. But nothing came. No creeping shadows. No gurgling laughter. The mansion was silent. Jonathan wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, trying to steady himself. He needed to leave. He needed to get out, to find the others, to find any way to escape. He couldn't stay in this cursed house for another minute. His eyes darted to the door. The hallway beyond was still dark, but the faintest sliver of light from the outside world was visible through a crack at the bottom of the door. That was all the hope he needed. There was a way out. He could feel it in his bones, deep down. There was a way to end this nightmare, to stop it from consuming anyone else. But as he moved toward the door, a sudden pressure, like a hand gripping his chest, stopped him in his tracks. The temperature in the room dropped once more, sending an icy chill through his spine. A distant but unmistakable sound filled the air. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the far end of the hallway, just outside the door. The rhythmic sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was approaching. Jonathan froze. He turned his head toward the noise, his breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed at him to run, to ignore the noise, to keep moving. But his feet wouldn't budge. His body was locked in place by fear, by something far more powerful than he could comprehend. The tapping continued, closer now. It wasn't the sound of human feet. No, these were heavier, more deliberate, as if someone was dragging their feet across the floor. The sound grew louder, closer still, until it felt like the very walls of the mansion were pressing in on him. Then the door creaked open. Jonathan gasped, stumbling backward as the door slowly swung on its hinges. And standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light, was a figure. A man, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes, his face twisted in a grimace of pain. His clothing was tattered, his skin pale, the flesh stretched tight over his bones. The man's mouth moved, as though he was speaking, but no sound came out. His hands, unnaturally long and bony, reached toward Jonathan with trembling fingers. The man's eyes were empty, void of any life. They stared at Jonathan with an intensity that made his skin crawl, as if they could see right through him, as if they could pierce through to the very core of his being. And then, without a word, the man stepped forward. Jonathan's heart raced as he took a step back, his body reacting on pure instinct. He didn't know who or what this was, but he knew it wasn't something he could fight. It wasn't human. No, it was something much older, something that belonged to this house, to the evil that had made it its home. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence alone spoke volumes, more terrifying than any words could express. The tap of its footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed through the room. With every step, the air seemed to grow heavier, thicker with dread. Jonathan could feel the suffocating weight of the spirit's malice bearing down on him. Without thinking, he turned and ran. His feet carried him down the hallway, every nerve screaming at him to keep moving, to get away from that creature, from the terror that followed him. He didn't dare look back. The sound of the figure's footsteps was unmistakable, close behind him, tapping relentlessly against the wooden floor. He rounded the corner, his eyes searching for any sign of a way out. The windows, closed and barred, offering no hope of escape. The stairs too far away, too steep, too dangerous in his panicked state. The tapping grew louder, closer. The figure was gaining on him. Jonathan sprinted toward a door at the end of the hallway, praying it would open. He yanked the handle with all his strength, desperate for any way to put distance between himself and the nightmare that was chasing him. The door groaned open, revealing a darkened room that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Without hesitation, he ran inside, slamming the door behind him, the wood creaking with the force of his panic. His breath was ragged as he pressed his back to the door, his chest heaving as he tried to steady himself. But the moment he took in the room before him, his stomach dropped. The room was filled with mirrors. Tall, ornate mirrors, their frames covered in dust and cobwebs, lined the walls, reflecting his own terrified face in every direction. The mirrors distorted his image, making it impossible to tell which was the real Jonathan and which was a reflection. His heart raced as he scanned the room, his eyes darting between the glass shards and the eerily quiet space around him. The tapping had stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Jonathan's breathing echoed in the room, his chest tight with the cold fear that still gripped him. Then slowly, one of the mirrors shifted. It wasn't a reflection. It was real. The mirror rippled, distorting like liquid glass bending to some unseen force. And in that reflection, Jonathan saw it. The figure from before, standing perfectly still in the mirror, its hollow eyes locked onto his own. But now its face twisted into a grim smile, a smile that spread unnaturally wide, showing rows of jagged teeth. The figure's fingers twitched, and the tapping began once more, louder, closer, relentless. Jonathan's blood ran cold as he realized the terrifying truth. The mansion was using the mirrors. The spirits, the darkness, it was all connected. The mirrors had been a conduit for something far worse than the house itself, a doorway for the evil to reach into the world. And now it was coming for him. As Jonathan stepped away from the mansion, a feeling of relief washed over him. The sunlight, bright and warm, seemed almost foreign after the long night he had spent within the mansion's dark, suffocating walls. His heart, still racing, began to slow, and he took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh air like a man who had just emerged from a deep, suffocating cave. But the feeling of safety was short-lived. He paused for a moment, looking back toward the mansion which loomed in the distance. It was still standing, silent and imposing, as if nothing had ever happened. The house seemed too still, too calm. Jonathan took another step, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone. He needed to call the others. He needed to know if they had made it out, if they were okay. But as his fingers brushed the screen, it flickered, just for a second. He frowned and tried again, but this time the screen remained blank, dead in his hands. His stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. The house was still watching him, even if he had walked away, even if he had escaped. He shook his head, trying to push away the thoughts that were creeping back into his mind. It had to be over. He had faced the horrors of the house and survived. It was done, but as he looked around, he felt it, an eerie sense of being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he whipped around, his eyes scanning the area. There was nothing but the empty road and the distant trees. No one in sight. And then, as if on cue, a faint tapping sound broke the silence. Jonathan's blood ran cold. He turned quickly, searching for the source, but there was no one there. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking in the distance. His heart hammered in his chest. He couldn't understand it. He had escaped. He had survived. And yet the house, the curse, seemed to follow him, lingering at the edges of his consciousness. He stumbled backward, his feet tangling as he tried to keep his balance. And then, as he looked back at the mansion one last time, he saw it. The figure. The gaunt, hollow-eyed figure from the mirrors. It stood in the window of the mansion, staring out at him. Its mouth twisted into that same horrific grin, and its hands pressed against the glass, leaving dark smudges where its fingers touched. Jonathan's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. He hadn't escaped. The mansion had never let him go. He turned and ran. He couldn't stay there. He couldn't let it pull him back in. His legs burned as he sprinted, desperate to put as much distance between himself and the house as possible. But no matter how fast he ran, the sound of tapping followed him, growing louder with every step. And just as he reached the edge of the woods, where he thought he might finally be free, he heard it. A whisper, soft, cold, and distant, yet somehow right in his ear. "You can't escape." Jonathan froze, his breath caught in his throat. The voice was familiar. It was the voice of the figure. But how? How was it still here, still tormenting him? He spun around, but the woods were empty. The mansion was gone. The figure was gone. But he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was standing just behind him. His knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, his hands pressed against the dirt, his chest heaving. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world spun around him as the whisper echoed in his mind. "You can't escape." But then, as quickly as the sensation came, it was gone. The air around him felt clearer. The tapping had stopped. The whispers had faded. Jonathan took a shaky breath, glancing behind him once more. Nothing. The woods were silent. The mansion was nowhere to be seen. Everything was still. For a moment, he dared to believe that he had truly escaped. But then, the ground beneath him shifted. The earth trembled beneath his feet, and the trees swayed ominously. Jonathan's heart leapt into his throat. His eyes widened in horror as the earth split, the ground cracking open like a wound, releasing a dark, shadowy mist that began to curl around him. The tapping returned, closer now, louder all around him. 100 footsteps echoed in the distance. 1,000 hands reached out from the earth. Jonathan's body screamed in terror, but his legs wouldn't move. His arms were paralyzed by fear. The darkness rose around him, consuming the world, until there was nothing but the whispering shadows. "You will never escape." Jonathan's scream was the last sound that echoed through the forest as the mist closed in, suffocating him in its cold embrace. And the mansion, still standing far in the distance, waited. The ground beneath Jonathan trembled violently as the darkness swallowed him whole, the air thick with the suffocating mist. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct telling him to run, to escape. But his limbs were heavy, frozen by the cold grip of fear that had taken hold of him. His breath came in shallow gasps as the mist wrapped around him, its cold fingers digging into his skin. The whispers had returned, louder now, more insistent. They clawed at his mind, their voices a maddening chorus. "You can't escape." The words echoed endlessly, a constant refrain that seemed to reverberate from the very earth itself. The trees around him twisted and contorted, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. Jonathan tried to move, but his legs refused to obey. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe. The mist clouded his vision, darkening everything until there was nothing but the sound of the tapping, the constant rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from every direction. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block it out, trying to push the fear away. But it was no use. The tapping grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was in his very bones. And then the whispers stopped. The world fell silent, the air heavy with the anticipation of something terrible about to unfold. Jonathan's chest tightened. He opened his eyes slowly, dreading what he might see. And then he saw it, the figure. The same gaunt, hollow-eyed figure that had haunted him throughout the mansion stood before him, its face twisted into a grotesque grin. Its hands reached out, long and spindly, its fingers elongated, sharp like claws. Its eyes were empty, void of any life, yet they burned with a terrible intensity as they locked onto Jonathan's own. He stumbled backward, fear surging through him as he looked around, desperately searching for a way out. But there was nowhere to run. The mist had completely enveloped him, and the figure stood in his path, its smile widening with every passing second. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice like 1,000 voices, overlapping and distorting. "You are ours now." Jonathan's heart raced as he took a step back, his mind a blur. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His body was paralyzed by the presence of the spirit, its malevolent energy crushing him from all sides. The tapping, that infernal tapping, filled the air once more, but now it was different. It was no longer a sound. It was a presence, something he could feel in the very marrow of his bones. The earth beneath him pulsed with the rhythm, and the mist seemed to rise, moving with the beat of the taps. He could feel it, the mansion, its power, its curse. It had never left him. It had followed him, creeping into every corner of his mind, its hold tightening with every passing moment. And then, with a sudden movement, the figure lunged. Jonathan screamed as its claws closed around his throat, its grip cold and unyielding. He gasped for air, his hands desperately clawing at the figure's arms, but it was no use. Its strength was impossible, its touch freezing his skin, numbing him from the inside out. The tapping grew louder, faster, as though the entire forest had joined in, the earth itself shaking with the rhythm of the spirits. Jonathan's vision blurred, his body growing weaker with every passing second. The figure's grin widened, its face now a mask of pure malice as it drew closer, its breath cold and rancid against his skin. "You will never escape," the figure hissed, its voice now a screech, an animalistic sound that rattled his bones. "This is your home now." The last thing Jonathan heard before everything went black was the sound of the tapping, echoing in the darkness, a haunting reminder of the mansion's curse. And then silence. The woods stood still, as if nothing had ever happened. The mist dissipated, the trees returned to their normal shape, and the forest seemed to breathe a quiet sigh of relief. The mansion, once a looming presence on the horizon, was gone, as though it had never existed at all. But deep within the woods, in the place where Jonathan had fallen, there was something new. A faint tapping, slow, steady, a rhythm that began to grow louder, as if it were reaching out from the earth itself. And somewhere, far off in the distance, a door creaked open. The cycle was beginning anew. The mansion, ever patient, waited in the shadows. The tapping grew louder, the rhythm now unmistakable. It reverberated through the ground, echoing through the trees, and even the air itself seemed to shudder in response. The quiet woods, once still and peaceful, now felt as though they were holding their breath. The very earth seemed to pulse with a dark, insistent energy. And then, in the distance, a shadow flickered at the edge of the forest. It was barely noticeable at first, just a flicker of movement, like a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. But as Jonathan's mind struggled to grasp what had happened, he realized something far more sinister was at work. The mist was coming back. It spread from the ground like a living thing, curling and twisting, reaching for the sky, enveloping everything it touched. It moved in unnatural ways, following the tapping, moving in rhythm, as if it were alive, as if it were aware. And from within the fog, the figure appeared again, familiar and horrifying, its gaunt, hollow-eyed face staring at him, its wicked grin stretched wide as it stepped forward. Jonathan's body went cold. His mind screamed in terror, but he couldn't move. He was trapped. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The mansion, the curse, had found him again. The figure's fingers reached toward him, long and sharp, its touch like ice. It spoke, its voice echoing with the hollow whispers of 1,000 lost souls. "Welcome home," it said softly, its voice so chilling that it seemed to freeze the very air. "The mansion has missed you." Jonathan's eyes widened in horror as the mist closed in around him, thick and suffocating. The figure's hand reached out to him, its long, twisted fingers brushing against his skin. The cold seeped into him, and for a moment, he felt the familiar sensation of dread, of hopelessness. The mansion had always been there, a presence lurking at the edges of his mind, waiting for him to return. The tapping grew faster now, a rapid beat that pulsed through his body, syncing with his racing heart. It was as if the mansion itself was calling to him, pulling him back into its depths. "You are one of us," the figure whispered, its voice like a death rattle. "You belong here in the shadows. You always have." Jonathan tried to scream, to break free, but the fog wrapped around him like chains, its icy tendrils tightening around his body. He felt the weight of the curse settling over him once more, an inescapable grip that crushed his every breath. He was powerless against it. He had never truly escaped. And then, as the figure's claws closed around his throat, Jonathan's mind finally understood. He was never meant to leave. The mansion had claimed him. The curse had claimed him. The spirits that haunted its halls would never let him go. In that moment, the tapping stopped. The whispers stopped. And the mansion, far off in the distance, remained still, as if waiting for the next chapter in its long, never-ending story. Somewhere, deep within the mansion's walls, the door creaked open once more. The sound of footsteps echoed through the abandoned halls, slow and deliberate. The cycle was complete. The mansion stood in its eerie silence, its crumbling walls no longer just the remnants of a forgotten past. They had become part of a living, breathing entity, one that fed on the fear of those who dared to trespass. Inside, the shadows lingered, darker than ever, stretching and crawling along the cold stone floors. The air was thick with the weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting, watching. Outside, the woods were silent once more, save for the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. But there was no peace to be found. The mist, now a permanent fixture of the landscape, swirled around the trees, twisting into unnatural shapes. It seemed alive, aware, as though it could sense the souls trapped within its grasp. And deep within the mansion, a door creaked open, the sound reverberating through the abandoned halls. The shadows shifted, as if stirred by the movement, and the faintest sound of footsteps echoed from within the darkness. The figure, the same one that had tormented Jonathan, now moved through the mansion's halls once again. It was no longer alone. Behind it, the others followed, ghastly, twisted shapes, their hollow eyes staring out from the darkness, their fingers twitching in anticipation. They were the spirits of the house, bound to its walls, condemned to wander forever. And now, they were joined by one more. Jonathan's body, lifeless and cold, was carried by the mist into the heart of the mansion, his once terrified eyes now empty, his soul lost within its cursed walls. The mansion had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before. He would become one of them, another wandering spirit, another lost soul who would forever haunt the halls. The figure that had first appeared to him stood at the foot of the grand staircase, its hollow eyes scanning the empty air. Its twisted grin spread wider, as though it had just received the final piece it had been waiting for. With a slow, deliberate movement, it turned and began to ascend the stairs, the others following in its wake. Jonathan's spirit, now bound to the mansion's curse, stood at the top of the stairs, staring out into the vast emptiness of the house. It felt as though everything had come full circle. The tapping, the whispers, the unrelenting pull of the mansion's darkness. Everything had led to this moment. And now there was no escape. The mansion, with its decaying walls and twisted, broken corridors, had once again found its latest victim. It had claimed another soul to wander its endless halls, trapped in an eternal cycle of torment and despair. The figure that had tormented Jonathan lingered in the doorway of the room where he had once faced his fears, its eyes now glowing faintly in the dim light. It turned to face the others, its grin stretching even further. "The cycle continues," it whispered, its voice a soft hiss, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. And the shadows seemed to stir in agreement, their dark forms shifting and swirling, merging together as the mansion's curse grew stronger. Out in the woods, the wind began to pick up again, the leaves swirling in a dance of their own. The mist, thick and oppressive, rolled toward the trees, creeping silently, as if the mansion itself were reaching out to claim anything that dared to approach. The mansion had not finished. Its hunger would never be sated. As the last light of day faded from the sky, the tapping began once more, echoing through the air, slow and steady, marking the beginning of yet another cycle. And somewhere in the distance the mansion waited, its hunger insatiable, its curse unbroken forever. And that's the end of the story. Make sure to like and subscribe.